I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 1, Shifting to the Military Industry is the Best Way Out. 1914, exactly 1 month after Germany declared war on France, the German army, employing the Schlieffen plan of West first, then East, swiftly broke through Belgium and entered France. At this point, the German vanguard was only about 30 kilometers from Paris, and all efforts by the main French forces to contain the German right wing had failed. Paris was in imminent danger. About 10 kilometers east of Paris, in the town of Darras on the banks of the Marne, old Francis sat fully clothed on the sofa, silently watching the flickering flames in the fireplace, a lit pipe in his right hand. His eyes were empty and deep, as if he were making a difficult decision. Beside him sat Bernard's two sons, Pierre and Djoka. However, they did not speak. Darkness and silence filled most of the living room. Francis's expression was slightly stiffer than usual. He slowly brought the pipe to his mouth and gently puffed, his two scimitar-like white beard dancing rhythmically in the firelight. Pierre, the eldest son, finally couldn't hold back any longer. He stood up and said, "Make a decision, father. Staying here isn't a wise choice. Government officials have already left Paris, which means they've abandoned this place. Everyone's running away now. If we don't leave now, it'll be too late." The younger son, Djoka, who had been sitting beside him, leaned forward slightly, his voice pleading, "Pierre's right, father. Leave. You can't stop the Germans. Nothing is more important than survival." Francis calmly moved his pipe aside, exhaling a long puff of smoke, and replied in a hoarse but firm tone, "You didn't experience that period. I was only 20 years old then, young, but already owning a textile factory, the largest textile factory in Paris. Do you know what happened? Just like today, the Germans attacked. They looted everything they could, and then arrogantly crowned themselves in Paris." At this point, Francis coughed a few times, and Djoka considerately handed him a glass of water. Pierre frowned. He knew his father was referring to the Franco-German War 43 years ago. He had been born then and hadn't experienced it firsthand, but every Frenchman knew about that war and considered it a disgrace. Note: the French refer to the Franco-Prussian War as the Franco-German War. After all, France had paid a 5 billion franc indemnity and ceded Alsace and Lorraine. From then on, everyone in France, from top to bottom, had the desire to defeat the Germans and avenge that humiliation. However, there's no point in bringing that up now, Pierre said impatiently. The point is that the Germans are attacking again. They will invade Paris like last time and seize our factories again. Francis took a sip of water, placed his glass on the coffee table beside him, and said calmly, "Last time, I abandoned my factory and left. This time, I intend to fight to the end." After the Franco-German War, Francis started from scratch again, spending nearly half his life painstakingly building an agricultural tractor factory. Now, the factory has more than 2,000 employees and produces more than 500 tractors every month. This was Francis's life's work, and he wouldn't give it up easily. Absolutely not. Pierre looked at Francis in disbelief. This was perhaps what people often called the generation gap. He even thought his father dared to stay out of selfishness. His 63-year-old father didn't have much time left anyway. But the younger generation didn't deserve to do this. They could easily sell everything they owned and enjoy their remaining years. Djoka patiently persuaded, "Father, if you're going to die, keeping the factory and machines is meaningless, even the money is meaningless." Francis just snorted and put on a sullen face. They wouldn't understand. He wasn't simply risking his life for money. This might be an opportunity, a chance to double his assets. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. That's an unchanging rule of business, and now was the time to take the risk. Unfortunately, neither of his sons considered this. They lacked the courage and vision. They simply saw him as a stubborn old man. Just then, a slightly childish voice softly rang out, "Mr. Francis, if you intend to stay here, why not bet more?" Francis was taken aback. Someone had actually seen through his thoughts. Turning his head to look at the corner from which the voice came, he saw his grandson, whom he didn't acknowledge. Djoka quickly stopped him. "Shut up, Charles. This is an adult matter." Djoka turned his gaze back to Francis and carefully explained, "Camille went to take care of her mother, so I took Charles with me. 18 years ago, Djoka married Camille, a maid, against Francis's wishes." Francis had always resented this marriage and refused to acknowledge it. This was why Charles called Francis Mr. instead of Grandpa. Francis ignored Djoka and asked the boy, "So, what do you think is the best way to increase the stakes?" Djoka looked at Francis with fear. His father had taken Charles's words seriously. Djoka was about to speak when Francis stopped him with a look. "Let him speak." Charles, who had been sitting in a chair covered with a blanket, sighed and stood up gracefully, his tone surprisingly mature for his age. "Sir, as far as I know, next to your tractor factory is a fairly large motorcycle factory that recently temporarily switched to producing machine guns. Is that right?" Francis's eyes immediately lit up. Yes, the Zadachi motorcycle factory. It had switched to producing machine guns about 2 weeks ago. After the outbreak of war, the government found that ammunition and firearms could not meet the needs of the front lines, so it transferred some of the firearms and ammunition production to private enterprises. The Zadachi motorcycle factory was one of the private enterprises fortunate enough to receive government orders and equipment support. Charles walked slowly to the fireplace, knelt down gently, and calmly added 2 more pieces of firewood. He said, "In times of war, the most profitable thing is arms. You don't object, sir, do you?" Francis hummed in agreement, which was obvious, but then he frowned. "What if my reserves aren't nearly enough to buy this motorcycle factory and its machine gun production line?" He was reluctant to admit his lack of working capital, even though that was what he meant. Charles didn't call Francis out on this, but he understood the tractor factory's predicament. 2 months ago, a gunshot in Sarajevo cast a shadow of war over all of Europe. Farmers and ranchers didn't know who would own their land, or whether they would be drafted into the army and go to the battlefield. Naturally, no one wanted to buy tractors for farming. Tractors became unsaleable, and a large number of orders were cancelled, plunging the tractor factory into crisis. Turning to the military industry was Francis's best way out. Charles turned around, half of his handsome face flushed red in the firelight, while the side facing Francis remained darker. He offered a suggestion. "I've heard you have 2 branch factories in the south, sir. Why don't you trade them for it?" Francis looked astonished. "Those 2 factories combined don't even amount to half the amount I need." Charles interrupted Francis. "He'll be willing to trade, sir. This is Paris. The Germans won't advance any further here. In other words, the 2 southern factories are safe." Francis instantly understood Charles's meaning. Although the 2 factories were only half the value of the motorcycle factory, the key was their safety. What could be more valuable than safety in wartime? Francis hesitated for a moment, then jumped up with a whoosh, quickly went to the coat rack, and took down his top hat and coat. "Give me the flashlight, Djoka. I should go talk to Sidaxi. If I wait too long, that guy might abandon the factory and run away." Pierre tried to stop him, but Francis had already taken the flashlight and left without looking back. Pierre and Djoka exchanged bewildered glances. They hadn't expected their father to be thinking about business at a time like this, and even to gamble away their last remaining safe assets. Djoka turned to Charles, his eyes filled with confusion. He hardly recognized his son anymore. Chapter 2. This boy is not simple. Djoka's feelings were understandable, given that Charles had transmigrated from the modern era. World War I had just begun, and everyone assumed it would end quickly. However, Charles knew the war had lasted over 4 years, with 1.69 million French soldiers expected to die. A 4.25% casualty rate, excluding the elderly, women, minors, and children of officials with connections, meant the soldier mortality rate was roughly 1 in 4. A terrifying number. 1 in 4 soldiers died. If the wounded were included, almost no soldier would survive the war. 17-year-old Charles was about to come of age, and barring unforeseen circumstances, he would be drafted into the army next year or the year after to experience the horrors of war. He didn't want to have gone through all that trouble to transmigrate here only to die inexplicably on the battlefield. To avoid this, he decided to find a valid reason not to go to war. Or, even if drafted, he could stay away from the fighting. Charles believed that military industry was a good way to achieve this. If he could provide the army with high-quality, even revolutionary, weaponry that would help France win the war, what reason would they have to throw themselves into battle? They could save their lives and make money at the same time. Why not? Francis returned in just over half an hour. He excitedly waved the documents in his hand and announced, "The motorcycle factory's ours." That guy was hesitating about abandoning the factory, but as soon as he heard about the exchange, he grabbed at it like a lifeline and signed the contract without hesitation. Pierre stared at Francis in astonishment. He thought this would take at least a day or two to negotiate, so he hadn't rushed to stop it. He hadn't expected the contract to be signed in the blink of an eye. "Father, is this really a good thing?" Pierre made no attempt to hide his pessimism and disappointment. "Now, all our assets are in Darvest. If the Germans come, we'll truly have nothing." Francis ignored Pierre's complaints. He smiled at Charles. "So, you, like me, think the Germans won't get here, is that right?" Francis had been closely monitoring the army's movements. He believed the French army was making a planned and strategic retreat, that they still had strength, and were waiting for an opportunity to counterattack. Based on this, he had staked everything. But Charles shook his head. "No, sir, quite the opposite. I think the Germans will get here." Francis was surprised by this answer. Although he stuck to his judgment, he didn't understand Charles's intentions. If the Germans did get here, wouldn't increasing the bet mean losing everything? Seeing Charles hesitate, Francis immediately realized there were some things he couldn't say in front of others. Francis originally didn't want to pay attention. What could a mere boy know? His previous words were nothing more than a publicity stunt to attract attention, something teenagers often do. But curiosity compelled Francis to speak with the young man. "All right, let's go to the study for a cup of coffee." Francis's tone was authoritative, like an officer giving a command. This made Charles feel uneasy. The old man wouldn't even acknowledge him as his grandson, so what right did he have to act like an elder? He hadn't fulfilled his duties as a grandfather, yet he took it all for granted? If it weren't for his plan to use this guy to develop the military industry, Charles wouldn't have bothered with him at all. The study was on the second floor, its layout simple yet elegant. Both walls were lined with bookshelves, densely packed with books. In the center was a mahogany desk, with only a lamp, a few chairs, and a three-tiered ladder. Charles and Francis sat facing each other at the desk, one in the main seat and the other in the secondary seat. The butler brought in 2 cups of coffee and placed them in front of each other, their rich aroma filling the air. Francis believed that only coffee beans grown in high-altitude and subtropical climates were particularly flavorful, hence their long-distance transport and doubled price. He leaned back elegantly in his chair, savoring the aroma before taking a small sip, his gaze fixed on the cup. "You seem to have something to say," he asked casually. Charles added a sugar cube to his coffee, stirred it with a spoon, and said slowly, "Sir, I think you should be more concerned with whether France can win this war than whether the Germans can reach this point." Francis retorted non-committally, "Isn't that the same thing?" Charles shook his head slightly. "No, sir. If France loses this war, regardless of whether the Germans reach this point, the factories will inevitably be looted." Francis looked up at Charles in surprise. The boy was right. Tractor factories, motorcycle factories, even machine gun production lines were what the Germans needed. Once the Germans win the war, the factory, only a dozen kilometers from Paris, will inevitably be doomed. They will move all their equipment, even the tractors, to Germany. Charles added, "So, what we need to do is twofold. First, help France win this war. Second, defend the Darvas. The former is the strategic direction, the latter the tactical direction. Only by winning both simultaneously can the factory's safety be guaranteed." Francis stared blankly at Charles, then suddenly laughed, his gaze towards Charles like a joke. "Kid, you seem eager to make a good impression on me, but you're overdoing it. Help France win the war? Defend the Darvas. If you were Napoleon, I might believe you, but..." Francis smiled and shook his head, a hint of disdain in his eyes. Charles rolled his eyes, speechless at Francis's arrogance. "Do I need to make a good impression on you?" However, he didn't intend to get too entangled with Francis on this issue. The most powerful rebuttal was to slap the old man in the face with facts. Charles noticed a map on the desk, the one Francis used to record tractor sales in various locations. Charles moved his coffee cup, picked up the map, and spread it out in front of him. While gesturing on the map, he confidently analyzed, "The Germans plan to encircle Paris with 2 army groups, the First Army to the west and the Second Army to the east. The First Army to the west is very fast. It has already left the Second Army 40 kilometers behind." Francis smiled and hummed in agreement. This kid knew a thing or two. However, these weren't secrets. Battle reports constantly came from the front, and retreating troops brought the latest information. Although this was remarkable for a 17-year-old, if the boy wanted to use this to gain his approval, he was wasting his time. Charles ignored Francis's strange look and continued, "If the war develops this way, the Germans will undoubtedly encircle Paris and win the war." Francis nodded slightly in acknowledgement of this deduction. Paris is the political center and transportation hub of France. If Paris falls, the morale of the French people and the mobilization of their troops will be severely affected, and the war will be practically over. But you have a way to change this situation. Francis's lips curled into a mocking smile. This arrogant fool really thinks he's Napoleon. Charles pointed to the position of the German First Army and said, "If it changes its marching direction, from encircling the west of Paris to the east, France might win this war." Francis shook his head slightly and joked, "Unfortunately, child, we cannot command the enemy's army." Francis put down his coffee cup, gesturing to see him out. He intended to end this pointless conversation. Charles understood. Francis might be a good businessman, but he knew nothing about military affairs and even ignorantly mocked others. Charles lightly traced a line forward with his finger. "You're right, sir. While we can't command the enemy army, we can change the direction of the French army's retreat, and this will attract the enemy's attention, because they want to annihilate the French army." Charles looked up and met Francis's gaze directly, as if looking at a fool. Francis's expression changed slightly. He vaguely sensed that this young man was not as simple as he had thought. Chapter 3 Everything is a transaction. However, Francis was clearly not so easily persuaded. He suppressed his disdain and said seriously, "Unfortunately, we also cannot command the Fifth Army of France. We cannot even influence the High Command. We are just somewhat successful businessmen." Francis shrugged slightly awkwardly, admitting to Charles that he had no background in the military and political spheres was embarrassing. The capitalists who controlled the lifeline of the country were not from the real economy. They were the 200 major shareholders of the Bank of France, the so-called 200 families. They enjoyed the privilege of issuing banknotes, controlling national loans, mastering the national economy, and even influencing national policy decisions. Although the France's tractor factory could be among the top 100 in France, it was merely a worker in the eyes of the bank's capital, with 7% of its net profit going into the bank's pockets every year through loan interest. Charles rolled up the map and set it aside, calmly replying, "We don't need to command them, nor do we need to influence the military high command, sir. Think about it," he continued. "The French Fifth Army has been relentlessly pursued by the Germans. They've likely lost food, ammunition, and even rifles. Their soldiers may have gone hungry for days. If you can purchase as much food as possible to prepare, coupled with the recent acquisition of a machine gun factory, you can provide the Fifth Army with the necessary supplies. It may not be much, but it's better than crowding into chaotic Paris and waiting to be surrounded, don't you think?" Francis understood Charles's thinking, using food to lure in smaller fish, then using those smaller fish to lure in larger fish, ultimately shifting the entire course of the war. However, are the Germans so easily fooled? Francis asked skeptically. Just because the Fifth Army changed its escape route, they'll change their plans to besiege Paris. That was the siege of Paris, the political center and transportation hub of France. Charles calmly replied, "If it were only the Fifth Army, they might not fall for it. But what if they mistakenly believe that France has no intention of defending Paris? Government officials have already retreated, civilians are fleeing, and the defenders are demoralized and unwilling to fight. If we spread the rumor that the defenders are ready to retreat, the Germans will only have an empty city. Do you think the Germans will still need to besiege Paris?" Francis was stunned. If Paris was an empty city, there was clearly no need to besiege it. Instead, pursuing the French Fifth Army would be more effective. After all, killing the enemy's manpower was the only way to quickly, effectively, and thoroughly defeat France and render them powerless. This was obvious. This greatly increased the likelihood of the Germans falling for the trap. Charles added, "I believe there are German spies everywhere in Paris who will pass these rumors on to the Germans." Francis nodded slightly, looking at Charles as if he were a stranger meeting him for the first time. Was this a plan devised by a 17-year-old? Is this the kind of wisdom a high school student could possess? Perhaps he hadn't paid enough attention to him, which is why he was so surprised by his performance today. Then, his businessman's habits made Francis weigh the pros and cons in his mind. This method is difficult to implement, but it does have a chance of success. And even a 1% chance is worth trying. because it will save France from its crisis and also save his own factory. Charles picked up his coffee, leaned back in his chair, took a small sip, and said calmly, "Sir, if we succeed, you will become a hero of France, you will be famous, everyone will know you, that's the best advertisement. Then, whether it's tractors, motorcycles, or machine guns, they will all sell out, France will cheer for you." Francis's eyes gradually brightened. He was shocked by the commercial benefits Charles described. No. Not just commercial benefits, he could also enter the military and political circles and become a pivotal figure in France, even able to compete with the 200 families. And the gamble was just to buy some grain and then inform the military. Francis, however, remained expressionless, his tone turning cold. "Do you think I would steal your idea and claim it as my own?" Charles shook his head. "No, sir. I beg you to do so, otherwise, they might conscript me." Francis was taken aback. He hadn't considered this. Indeed, if Charles possessed such military talent, and France was at war, even though he wasn't yet of conscription age, he might be exceptionally drafted. After all, this was a necessity of war. Therefore, this could only have been Francis's idea. Francis looked at Charles somewhat guiltily, then, "You?" He felt he had stolen something from the boy, especially since this boy was someone he had always despised. Charles generously offered a smile. "I have no problem with that, this has always been your idea, sir. I'm just here for a cup of coffee." As he spoke, Charles raised his coffee cup, praising, "Excellent coffee." Francis considered for a moment, then became frank. "Merchants always operate on a win-win basis, as long as it's viewed as a transaction, there's no stealing," he said. "You're right, Charles. I think we should start moving soon. Can you assist Mr. Joseph in managing the tractor factory?" The tractor factory didn't need assistance. This was a degree of recognition of Charles's status, a test, or perhaps an exchange. Charles understood, of course, what this seemingly casual remark meant. He had originally wanted the machine gun factory, but it should be done step by step. "Yes, sir," Charles replied, "it would be my pleasure." As Francis came downstairs, Pierre and Djoka, who had been whispering, simultaneously rose to greet him, seemingly curious about the conversation in the study. Francis suddenly understood why Charles had avoided others. If word got out to the Germans, they wouldn't be able to change their marching route to pursue them east of Paris, and Charles would be drafted. A brilliant fellow, Francis thought to himself. Then he turned his gaze to Djoka, nodding approvingly. "You've raised a good son, Djoka, and you've educated him well, father." Djoka was flattered. Francis rarely praised him. In his father's eyes, he was always the indecisive, sentimental type, while a successful businessman should be as decisive and ruthless as Pierre. Francis didn't say much, turning his gaze to Pierre. "I'm going to Paris. Use all our reserves to buy grain, even if it means exchanging tractors." Pierre looked terrified. "Father, this will leave us penniless and reduced to beggars." "Do as I say," Francis interrupted Pierre sharply. "Yes, father," Pierre replied helplessly. Francis again took his top hat and coat from the hanger and hurried out the door. As he climbed into his Ford Model T, he couldn't help but sigh. His two children were not as good as one. At the same time, Francis was somewhat puzzled. How could a maid's child be so outstanding? Chapter 4 Gallery. At the headquarters of the 6th Army in Paris, telephones rang incessantly, and documents and intelligence flew like snowflakes onto Lieutenant General Gallieri's desk. Amidst the constant flow of people, Gallieri was one of France's most capable generals, having competed with Joffre for the position of Commander-in-Chief of France. The reason he lost to Joffre was supposedly due to his advanced age. This explanation was unreliable, as he was only 3 years older than Joffre. The real reason was that Joffre succumbed to capitalism, while Gallieri hated capitalism and opposed it at every turn. His defeat was therefore understandable. The most obvious point was that if Joffre had been competent as Commander-in-Chief of France, there would have been no need to recall the retired Gallieri to oversee the defense of Paris at the start of the war. Why wasn't Gallieri's age considered a factor then? Gallieri was resentful. He had been sidelined during peacetime, only remembered during wartime. Was he letting others enjoy the good times while he bore the bad? What was even more infuriating was that the wealthy capitalists and government officials who usually indulged in a life of luxury in Paris all fled at the first sign of trouble, leaving him and his troops to await their doom in Paris. For Gallieni, this battle was indeed tantamount to waiting for death. He knew all too well that the French army was far inferior in quality to the German army, thus putting Paris in a dilemma. To fight outside the city would mean being routed by the Germans like the Fifth Army. Staying in the city, although fortified, meant facing encirclement and the starvation of over 2 million soldiers and civilians without supplies. Yet, Gallieni had no choice but to accept this mission that could cost him his life. He knew in his heart that he had to save millions of poor French soldiers and civilians. How could he break this curse? Gallieni pinned his hopes on the retreating Fifth Army. Pointing to the map, he told Major General Monnery, commander of the Sixth Army, there's only one way forward. The Fifth Army must hold its ground, and together with the other two armies, hold off the enemy's First Army. Major General Monnery replied with difficulty, but Your Excellency, the Fifth Army is in complete disarray. They've lost all their supplies and a large amount of ammunition. I'm not sure if they have any rifles left. After a pause, Major General Monnery added, Paris might still have some supplies, but once we let the Fifth Army in or take the supplies out, the rest is history. Both armies would be trapped inside Paris, unable to move. Furthermore, the supplies in Paris should be prepared for a future siege. Taking them out of the city would be unwise. Just as Gallieni was at his wit's end, a staff officer stepped forward and reported, Lieutenant General, a merchant named Francis has offered to help us. He will do everything in his power to buy food, and he also has a machine gun factory. All of this can be supplied to our retreating troops free of charge. Gallieni's eyes lit up, and he asked, Where? I mean the exact address. The staff officer searched on the map for a moment, then pointed to a point and replied, Here, Dario's. Gallieni was overjoyed. Dario's, located southeast of Paris and on the south bank of the Marne, was the perfect place for the Fifth Army to rest and organize a counterattack. Get to headquarters, Gallieni ordered. He needed to report the situation to Joffre and suggest he change the Fifth Army's retreat direction. Gallieni exclaimed inwardly, God, we're saved. It seems capitalists aren't all bad. Little did he know that this favorable situation was only just beginning. At dawn, the town of Dario's awoke to birdsong, and sunlight dispelled the thin mist, shining through the window onto Charles's face. Having been practically driven out of their home, the Joka family didn't live with Francis. Francis's luxurious villa and factory were in an open area a kilometer outside the town, while the Jokas lived in the southeast corner. At that moment, the Joka family was having breakfast, bread, sausage, and a glass of milk. Charles wasn't quite used to the food, but adhering to local customs, he didn't say much. Taking a bite of the dry, hard bread, Charles mumbled to Joka across from him, Father, may I borrow your bicycle? Joka agreed without hesitation, but then added, Where are you going? The Germans could attack at any moment. I think you'd better stay home. Camille, who was busy in the kitchen, tensed instantly upon hearing the conversation. She lifted her skirt, picked up her plate, and sat down next to Charles, saying, Listen to your father, don't go out. She then cast a questioning look at Joka. Shouldn't we go south to hide? How did the talk go last night? Joka hesitated, unsure how to answer. He couldn't very well say that Charles had pushed things in a different direction, could he? Charles answered his earlier question, I need to go to the tractor factory. Francis wants me to assist Joseph in managing the tractor factory. Joka and Camille immediately stopped what they were doing and stared at Charles in surprise. Camille suddenly realized something and covered her mouth, seemingly trying to suppress a cry. She turned to Joka, who nodded slightly to indicate that it was true. Although Joka didn't know the exact reason, he knew it must be related to the conversation in the study last night. Go, Joka nodded solemnly, but come back early. He then added, if you hear any rumors, I mean about the Germans, come back immediately. Yes, sir. Charles finished his milk in a few gulps, grabbed his half-eaten bread, and went out. Watching Charles ride away on his bicycle, Camille excitedly asked Joka, does this mean Mr. Francis approves of Charles? Joka's expression was somewhat strange. He replied, I think father might approve of more than just Charles. Camille asked doubtfully, what? Joka explained, father said last night that we've raised the children very well. I think he might approve of us because of Charles. Camille was stunned for a moment, but she still couldn't believe it. Are you serious? Because of Charles? Joka nodded with both emotion and relief. Yes, because of Charles, he seems to have grown up. Camille was overwhelmed with emotion, and tears welled up uncontrollably. For many years, Camille had considered herself a sinner. Joka and Charles had lost their right to inherit the Bernard family business because of her. Now, things seemed to have taken a turn for the better, and she had hope of being able to put down the heavy burden on her shoulders. However, Joka was a little worried. "You weren't there last night, and Charles, he's as shrewd as father." "I'm not sure if that's a good thing. He's different from your father, Joka," Camille immediately retorted. "He's your son. You should be proud of him." "So, of course it's a good thing." Joka shut up. He knew he couldn't reason with a woman, especially a mother. Chapter 5. Deserters deserve praise. Charles paid no heed to family feuds. Francis was a legend to the Bernard family, a business prodigy who repeatedly rose from nothing to enter French high society. He was the pillar of the Bernard family, an insurmountable figure. To gain his approval was practically a guarantee of a comfortable life and an immense honor. But Charles didn't care about any of that. To be precise, he didn't take Francis seriously. In Charles's eyes, Francis was merely a stepping stone on his path to advancement. The bicycle traveled smoothly along the town's paved streets. There weren't many people on the streets. Those who could escape had already fled. Those remaining were either homeless or, like Francis, reluctant to abandon their possessions, even though their holdings were meager. Ahead, some French soldiers appeared, wearing blue military jackets, bright red flat-topped caps, and military trousers, rifles slung over their shoulders, but most without backpacks. Charles figured they must have discarded their backpacks to lighten their load during their escape. This meant things were going as he hoped. The Fifth Army was already retreating towards Darvez. Suddenly, a group of soldiers blocked Charles's path. Not blocking, but rather roughly grabbing Charles's bicycle to stop him, causing Charles to nearly fall. "Little guy, slow down." The leading soldier was a major with a small mustache, his face weary and eyes bloodshot. His uniform had dark red stains, indistinguishable between mud and blood. "Can you tell me where the Siddiqui machine gun factory is?" the mustachioed major asked. "I'm going there," Charles replied. "Actually, I'm going to the place next to the machine gun factory. I can take you." Charles knew these were soldiers urgently needing to replenish their ammunition. "Very good." The mustachioed major glanced at Charles, then reassured him. "Don't be nervous, little guy. The Germans might not arrive until tomorrow, or maybe not." This information was a reward for Charles is volunteering to lead the way. Charles pushed the cart, asking as he walked, "The situation is bad, isn't it?" The mustachioed major merely grunted seemingly reluctant to describe the horrific conditions at the front to a young boy. Charles sized up the mustachioed major and the soldiers behind him, saying, "You are brave soldiers." The mustachioed major seemed stung. He turned and glared at Charles, his eyes growing increasingly red, his voice low and menacing. "Are you mocking us, kid? Watch your mouth." "No, Major," Charles replied earnestly. "Everyone else is searching for food while you're searching for ammunition, and you've maintained formation throughout, which means you're preparing for battle." The mustachioed major looked at the other soldiers around him. It seemed indeed true. Then he realized he had misjudged the boy. "Sorry, kid, however, you shouldn't use the word brave to describe deserters." The mustachioed major looked somewhat embarrassed. Charles persisted. "The fact that you maintained morale and formation during the most dangerous and chaotic times is commendable in itself." Charles's words were half-truth, a tactic of praise. Clever teachers have tricks up their sleeves. They know how to deal with struggling students. Criticism only makes them more mischievous, while a few words of praise will motivate them to strive to be worthy of that praise. Charles frequently received this type of praise from teachers of various subjects. The mustachioed major gave Charles a surprised look. This young man seemed to know quite a lot. "What are your plans?" Charles asked again. The mustachioed major shrugged helplessly. "Replenish your ammunition before considering the next step. Ideally, you should have a good meal, get some sleep, and then wait for orders. By the way, I heard they can provide us with food here." Charles answered confidently. "Yes." Then he asked, "Or maybe you won't even get orders, am I right?" The mustachioed major nodded. At this point, the troops were in a state of disarray. Even if there were orders, they were vague directions without specific details, such as continue the retreat, rest in place, or await orders. They couldn't even find their superiors or know who was in command. Charles offered a timely suggestion. "Why don't you all work for me? I need a squad of soldiers." The mustachioed major turned and stared blankly at Charles, momentarily speechless. Laughter from his soldiers erupted behind him. "Oh, we'll have to take his orders. He's a young man who wants to be a general, a good young man, isn't he? He's not even as tall as our rifles. Is he sure he won't wet his pants when he hears gunfire?" The mustachioed major looked at Charles with interest. a mocking smile playing on his lips. "So, General, what are you planning to do?" Charles pointed to the factory buildings in the open field not far ahead and answered without hesitation, "Defend the machine gun factory. The Germans will focus their attack on it. I believe the Germans will leave their artillery and supplies far behind while pursuing you. They also need the machine guns and ammunition from the machine gun factory. We just need to guard the tractor factory next door, and when they think they are about to succeed, we'll suddenly give them a surprise attack." Charles didn't mind demonstrating some military talent on a tactical level. They couldn't just conscript him, still a minor, into the army based on a few words. The mustachioed major's expression changed. This seemed like a feasible and well-organized plan. The major glanced at the soldiers behind him, whose faces also became serious. Only now did they realize that the Germans had stretched their supply lines too far during the pursuit, and that the Germans also lacked ammunition and needed machine gun factories. Therefore, machine gun factories would naturally be the Germans' focus of attack. Someone muttered, "He seems more reliable than Colonel Lyon." The soldiers fell silent. Colonel Lyon had been killed in his first battle. He was a graduate of the St. Cyr Military Academy with excellent grades. During the attack, he stood at the very front of the column, 5 meters beyond the attack line, wearing striking white gloves that perfectly complemented his blue overcoat and red trousers, forming the French tricolor flag. At the start of the battle, his chest adorned with medals, head held high, sword pointed at the enemy, and a commanding shout echoed, "Charge, lads! Kill them all!" The next second, he was riddled with bullets in front of everyone, and the 9th Infantry Regiment was immediately without command, a loss it was borne to this day. The mustachioed major, seemingly struck by Charles's reminder, turned and ordered, "Simon, Teddy, go and fetch the rest. Have them assemble at the tractor factory. We need more men." "Yes, Major," 2 soldiers responded, running off in opposite directions in perfect unison. The mustachioed major quickened his pace to catch up with Charles, introducing himself. "My name is Brownie, and yours is Charles." "My name is Charles." Brownie shook hands with Charles and said, "Let me give you some advice, Charles. You'd better take your family and leave." Charles smiled slightly. "Let me give you some advice, Major. You'd better start your counterattack from here, because you have nowhere to retreat. If you retreat one more step, Paris will be surrounded, then the tragedy of the Franco-German War will repeat itself, and we will lose the war again, ceding territory and paying reparations." Charles's words once again shocked the soldiers, including Major Brownie. They couldn't imagine that a boy who was still so young could have such courage and insight. Looking at themselves, their minds were habitually focused on retreating to save their lives. The atmosphere became strange, filled with shame and embarrassment, and the soldiers' gait became somewhat unnatural. After a long pause, someone coughed lightly and said, "He's right. We can't retreat any further. Paris can't fall into German hands." Immediately, others echoed this. "Yes, haven't we had enough of the humiliation of the Franco-German War? For over 40 years we've wanted revenge. Is this our revenge?" Someone else chimed in, "We must find a way to defeat the Germans. We can't go on like this. Otherwise, we'll live in humiliation for the rest of our lives." From birth to death, Charles was pleased with the soldiers' words. He had successfully ignited the fighting spirit of these deserters. Chapter 6 for France. Charles took Brownie to the machine gun factory to collect ammunition. The process went unexpectedly smoothly. The staff gave Charles the green light the moment they saw him, even providing Major Brownie with 10 more M1909 Hotchkiss machine guns. Charles understood this was because they knew what had happened the previous night, including Francis's changed attitude towards the Jalkas. Factory employees were always particularly sensitive to such matters. They would get insider information from the butler and servants, their sensitivity and speed comparable to military intelligence. Joseph, as the head of the tractor factory, was no exception. He had received a notification from Francis the previous night. "Starting tomorrow, Charles will assist you in your work." Joseph had worked for Francis for 20 years and naturally understood what Francis meant. This was essentially handing over the tractor factory to Charles, provided Charles proved his ability to manage it in the coming period. Shouldn't this be Pierre's property? Joseph wondered. Francis was a visionary. He had long planned his successor. Pierre had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. His eldest son, Jarrell, was studying economics in England, the chosen one to inherit the family fortune and go into business. His second son, Dorian, was groomed to be a lawyer, aiming for a political career. His third son, Harry, was sent to military school, but unfortunately, he was now an officer on the battlefield, his fate unknown. All of this was Francis's arrangement. He intended for his 3 grandsons to develop in the military, politics, and business respectively, thus building a powerful force for the Bernard family and placing them among the 200 families. To this end, he meticulously planned a marriage between his granddaughter, Elise, and one of the 200 families to pave the way for their future. As for Joca's only son, Charles, he was an exception long ago, excluded from the family's development plan. But now he had suddenly returned and become the heir apparent to the tractor factory. What was the deeper meaning behind this? After a moment's thought, Joseph seemed to understand. Was it because the Germans were about to invade? Similar to General Gallieri being appointed military commander of Paris in a time of crisis. Poor young Master Charles. Joseph felt deep sympathy for Charles's plight. He lost his inheritance simply because of his mother's status and was forced to live and attend school with children from poor families. However, Joseph knew that the affairs of the wealthy were none of his business. He would do as Francis arranged. Early the next morning, Joseph waited at the factory gate. He saw Charles pushing his bicycle up, followed by a large group of heavily armed soldiers. His expression changed, and he hurried forward, asking with concern, "Young Master Charles, what happened? Are they giving you trouble?" Joseph had watched Charles grow up and considered him almost like a son. He wouldn't allow anyone to bully him. Major Brownie glanced at Charles in surprise. "You're the young master? Are these factories yours?" He looked Charles up and down again as he spoke. Charles was wearing a coarse cloth coat, a cheap, frayed cap, and riding a broken bicycle. He certainly didn't look like a wealthy person. Charles replied, "Not entirely. I'm only temporarily in charge, thanks to the Germans." Major Brownie's expression suddenly changed, and he gave a self-deprecating laugh. "So, your plan was actually for us to protect your factory? Head, clever little fellow. You've used us." The soldiers behind him also showed resentment. Most of them came from working class and peasant backgrounds and hated capitalists to the core. Now, hearing that they were being used by Charles, this small capitalist, and even under the guise of patriotism to protect his factory, they all gritted their teeth in hatred. "We've gotten to this point because of you capitalists. We died on the front lines because we were tricked by you. And now you're pulling the stunt. That wretched little fellow, we were almost fooled by his appearance." Charles calmly turned to face Major Brownie and his soldiers. "Watch your words, Major. In principle, the tractor factory, motorcycle factory, and machine gun factory that you are supposed to protect belong to the same owner. Not long ago, they gave everything, providing you with food and ammunition for free. They could have escaped with the rest of their assets, but they didn't." Charles intended to use this to gain favor. This was crucial. Only with the soldiers' approval would they risk their lives to protect the factory. Major Brownie was skeptical. He didn't believe any capitalist would be willing to do such a thing. Just then, a soldier behind them said, "I heard about it. It seems a merchant named Francis used all his savings to buy food overnight." "I heard that too. That's why we changed our marching direction and chose Darvez as our stop." Joseph added at the opportune moment, "Yes, these factories belong to Mr. Francis. What you heard is true. He gave everything to this war, to France. He even sold factories in the safe south to buy a machine gun factory." Then Joseph turned his gaze to Charles. "He is Mr. Francis's youngest grandson, Master Charles. Is there anything else you don't understand?" Major Brownie stood at attention, saluted Joseph, and said, "Understood, sir. Salute to you, salute to Mr. Francis." And Major Brownie's eyes were filled with apology as he looked at Charles. "Salute to you, Master Charles." "I'm so sorry." Charles raised an eyebrow and said generously, "It's all right, Major, we are all doing this for France." Major Brownie trembled instantly, feeling a surge of heat rush to his head. He nodded, moved, his eyes filled with unwavering resolve. "Yes, for France." The soldiers behind him echoed in unison, "For France, for France." They were utterly captivated by the young man's spirit. What a magnificent soul! Though young and frail, though a capitalist with wealth, he possessed a heart of gold, willing to give everything for his country. Standing before him, the soldiers even felt ashamed. Then, through their eyes and expressions, the soldiers reached a consensus. This capitalist is different. He is a patriotic capitalist. Such a capitalist absolutely deserves protection. Such a capitalist should not be eliminated by the enemy, but should lead us to victory. Charles was quite satisfied, but a perfect ending was still needed. Charles turned to Joseph. "Take them to a good meal and then arrange for them to sleep. These are warriors who defend France. They deserve it." Joseph nodded. "Yes, sir." "Gentlemen, follow me." The soldiers were overjoyed, nodding or raising their caps in salute as they passed Charles. "Thank you very much, sir. You are a good man, sir." Charles called out to Major Brownie, "Get some rest, Major. You only have 4 hours of rest. Training will begin after lunch." "Training?" Major Brownie looked bewildered. Did this kid know how to train soldiers? Chapter 7 Tractor turns into tank. Charles strolled through the tractor factory. The France's tractor factory was considered a large-scale enterprise in France. Of the 257 companies in France with over 1,000 employees, most were small businesses with 50 or 60 workers. The France's tractor factory, however, had over 2,000 employees. This was thanks to France's significant investment 2 years prior in importing the Holt 60 tractor from Britain. This was the world's first track tractor with an internal combustion engine, developed only in 1911. After importing this tractor, France decisively defeated all its competitors, capturing 70% of the market share and becoming the leading manufacturer of agricultural tractors in France, thus enabling his factory to reach its current scale. Everyone in the town of Biarritz gained a job as a result, and many others came from other places to earn money, even from Paris, which drove up prices and rents in Biarritz. The assembly workshop was large, with over a dozen tractors still under assembly parked in the center. Workers were busy moving about, the clanging of metal and the clatter of chains moving parts creating a bustling, energetic atmosphere. However, Charles could tell that the workers were more or less distracted, and the pace was much slower than usual. This wasn't because the tractors were piling up in the warehouse due to recent overstocking, but because the Germans would soon be attacking, and the workers were unsure if their efforts were even worthwhile. Just as Charles was considering his next move, a familiar voice called his name. Turning around, he saw Matthew peeking out from behind the tractor, wearing oil-stained war clothes, waving a wrench at Charles, and sporting a bright smile. Charles smiled back and quickly stepped forward. Matthew was Joseph's son, 2 years older than Charles, and they had been classmates until middle school. Perhaps because of Joseph's connection to the Bernard family, Matthew had always taken care of Charles since childhood. Over the past decade, Charles had been bullied quite a bit. Most of Charles's classmates were farmers and workers exploited by capitalists. Some were unable to receive expected compensation due to labor disputes or work injuries, while others couldn't afford the 5% to 10% interest rates on bank loans. The latter was entirely the fault of the 200 family banks, and had nothing to do with the Bernard family. With nowhere to seek justice and no way to survive, their children would vent their anger on Charles, this capitalist. Charles thus earned many nicknames, such as bastard, vampire, and hypocrite. At these times, Matthew would always step in front of Charles, raising his fist and shouting at them, "Want to try my fist? Then come on, you bastards." Matthew wouldn't reason with them, he always solved problems with his fists. This seemed to work very well. Charles had survived to this day, and even in high school without Matthew, few dared to bully him. Matthew put down his wrench and gave Charles a warm hug, completely ignoring the oil stains on his work clothes. "I heard you're going to be in charge of the tractor factory." Matthew's eyes shone with sincerity. "I'm so happy for you. Looks like Francis has finally acknowledged you." Charles chuckled self-deprecatingly. "It's only temporary. I don't care about that. I've been thinking about something." Matthew glanced around, half-jokingly. "If you're in charge here, will I become your employee?" "What should I call you then?" Charles gave a serious raised his head, put his hands behind his back, and struck an arrogant pose. "Young Master Charles? Or Mr. Or Master, get lost." Matthew laughed and shoved Charles aside, putting his arm around Charles's shoulder. After a while, Matthew said seriously, "But you might not have a chance." "Why?" Charles asked, puzzled. Matthew shrugged. "Have you forgotten I'm already 19? You received a conscription order." Charles's eyes showed a hint of fear. Matthew nodded. "They need more manpower. If nothing unexpected happens, I'll be going to Paris for training the day after tomorrow." The legal conscription age in France is 20, but during wartime, no one enforces this law, just like there are underage child laborers everywhere in factories. Charles fell silent, his mind racing. Was Matthew 3/4 or 1/4? If 3/4, would he lose a hand or a leg, or both? Matthew seemed to see Charles's worry. He easily raised his head and smiled. "Don't worry, Charles. By the time I finish my training, this war should be over. I'll be fine." As mentioned before, everyone thought the war would end quickly, either a win or a loss, at most a month or two later. But Charles knew that wasn't the case. Young Master Charles, Joseph appeared before them, glaring angrily at Matthew, seemingly warning him not to be so casual in front of young Master Charles. Matthew responded to his father's overreaction with an eye roll. He waved at Charles, turned to the half-assembled tractor, and exclaimed dramatically, "Come on, ladies, who else needs to get dressed?" Joseph ignored Matthew and led Charles out of the workshop, saying, "Excuse me, Master Charles. Matthew is always so disrespectful. Master Charles, perhaps you should take a look at the engine production line. That's the heart of the factory." "No, Joseph," Charles interrupted him. "I need 12 tractors in good condition." "Tractors?" Joseph looked at Charles in confusion. "We also need some steel plates," Charles asked Joseph. "Do we have steel plates?" "Of course," Joseph replied. "This is a tractor factory. Many parts are pressed from steel plates." "How thick?" Charles asked. Joseph answered knowingly. "We have 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 5 millimeters, and 9 millimeters. The 9 millimeter steel plates were used to make the tracks." 9 millimeters it is, Charles said. "Also, prepare a workshop, welding equipment, skilled workers, and some paper and pens." "Can you do that?" "Of course," Joseph replied. "It would be my pleasure to do it." Joseph was bewildered. Was young Master Charles going to modify the tractor? Or was he treating it like a toy? Joseph wanted to remind young Master Charles that this period was crucial. Master Francis would decide whether to hand over the factory to him based on his performance. So, of course, he couldn't act recklessly. But he didn't say these words aloud. Joseph saw determination in young Master Charles' eyes. He probably knew what to do, Joseph thought. While Joseph was making preparations, Charles was drawing up plans in Joseph's office. With a ready-made tractor chassis, modifying it into a tank wasn't difficult. It couldn't even be called a tank, it was more like an armored vehicle. It was simply adding steel plates around the tractor and leaving a few machine gun ports. Cannons were unnecessary for the time being, they would be too heavy and would become too complicated. Machine guns were sufficient. The only problem was that the 9mm steel plate was too thin. A German Mauser rifle could penetrate it at around 100 meters. Charles considered overlapping 2 layers of steel plates and welding them to the chassis, but estimated the whole 60s engine couldn't support such weight. A simpler method was to design the frontal armor to be sloped, increasing both the probability of ricochets and the effective thickness. The machine gun would be a Hotchkiss, its drawback being that the magazine feed limited the gun's rotation angle. With 2 gunners and a driver, a total of 3 crew members, the weight should be manageable, right? As long as it could move, speed and mobility weren't important. After all, it was the first tank in human history, and one completed in a single day. Good enough was good enough, no need to be greedy. There would be plenty of time and space for future improvements. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 8 Rumors. As dusk fell, the setting sun filtered through the leaves of the plane trees, casting faint, fading shadows on the second floor of the 6th Army Command Post. A staff officer, after receiving a phone call, approached Leary with a puzzled expression. "General, a rumor has been circulating in the city today, saying that we've abandoned Paris, the army is retreating, and that all troops will be out of Paris tonight." Leary was taken aback. The troops in Paris had clearly not retreated, not a single one. Why would such a rumor exist? Spread by the Germans? Was it intended to demoralize the army? Leary immediately dismissed this idea. This could only demoralize the Parisian populace, not the army. At most, it would only induce hesitant citizens to leave Paris. If it wasn't the Germans spreading this rumor, then who was? And what was the purpose? Just as Leary was considering several possibilities, another staff officer rushed forward to report, "General, we've discovered that the German First Army has changed its marching route. They're chasing our 5th Army around to the east of Paris." "What?" Leary's eyes widened. "Are you sure this intelligence is accurate?" "Confirmed," the staff officer replied. "Our pilots saw it clearly. The Germans changed their marching direction, Galleri strode to the map and swept the paper, pens, and rulers on it to the ground. He pointed lightly at the map and said, "If that's the case, the flank of the German First Army is completely exposed to Paris. They're practically jumping into our encirclement." "Why would they do that?" Major General Manuri, commander of the Sixth Army, also found it strange. He thought for a moment, his tone uncertain. "General, could this be related to rumors?" "Rumors?" Galleri looked up. "You mean, the rumors about our withdrawal from Paris?" Major General Manuri nodded and explained, "If the Germans knew there was an army group in Paris, they certainly wouldn't have changed their route to pursue the Fifth Army like this. But if," Galleri chimed in, "if they think Paris is an empty city, then the encirclement is pointless. The best option is to continue pursuing the Fifth Army." "Yes," Major General Manuri said, "that makes sense. The Germans' relentless advance has made them complacent, so they didn't bother to verify the rumors and simply assumed Paris was an empty city." Major General Manuri then added, "If you look at it that way, this rumor is very advantageous to us. It successfully lured the Germans into our encirclement." Galleri's eyes gleamed. "Whoever spread it, one thing is certain, our luck has arrived." Manuri, "Get the soldiers ready for battle immediately, General. Any action we take requires General Joffre's permission," Major General Manuri reminded him. Galleri frowned, "Then ask him for permission, and at the same time, prepare for battle." Galleri cursed inwardly. Preparing for battle should require permission, right? As darkness fell, Major Brownie and his soldiers continued training in the square, following behind the tractors. The square was large, about 2 acres. It was the tractor factory's testing ground, with various terrains, roads, muddy paths, uneven vegetable patches, and even swamp-like fields. It was suitable as a training ground for the troops, except that the open area outside the factory didn't have such complex terrain. It was just a wide meadow on one side, with the Marne River a kilometer to the north. There were more than 300 soldiers, the vast majority of whom were Major Brownie's men. At that time, the French Army's organization consisted of about 268 men in a company and 4 companies in a battalion. Although Major Brownie was only a battalion commander, he had more than 1,000 men under his command. Unfortunately, only these 300-odd men managed to reach the town of Oise. "Major," Charles heard a soldier shout, "what's the point of us following these tractors? Are they going to take bullets for us?" The tractors on the training ground were the original Holt 60 model tractors, not yet equipped with tanks. At this time, the tanks were not yet completed, and the tanks carrying thick steel plates would likely break down soon after being used for training. More importantly, Charles didn't intend to reveal the tank to the world so soon. When the British invented the tank, to catch the enemy off guard on the battlefield and create as much psychological shock as possible, they called this thing, known as a land cruiser, a water tank, or tank. Charles felt that secrecy was necessary. Major Brownie, the only one besides Charles who knew the truth, turned his gaze to Charles, who was watching from the side, as if to say, "It's about time, the workers have gone home, it's time to let the soldiers know the truth." Charles casually stepped forward and said to the soldiers, "You're right, they can indeed stop you from bullets, because when you went to the battlefield, you used tractors equipped with steel plates." The soldiers were in an uproar, whispering among themselves, "Will this work? Are you sure it's not a child's toy? It can go to the battlefield." Of course, there were doubts, not only because Charles was a boy, but also because tanks had never existed before. The soldiers couldn't help but wonder, if this works, why wasn't it used before? Why didn't others think of this method? Charles joked, "These grumpy ladies," referring to the tractors, "are willing to take bullets for you, aren't you happy about that?" The soldiers chuckled knowingly, then they realized, something is better than nothing. "You're right, how about we switch back to charging at the enemy with rifles like before? I think having tractors is better." Charles, Djoka and Camille appeared anxiously behind him. They had come looking for Charles since it was dark and he hadn't returned, and were surprised to see him with a group of dirty soldiers. Djoka quickly stepped forward and pulled Charles behind him, his eyes filled with fear as he said to the soldiers, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm sorry to bother you. I'll take him back now." "No, father," Charles interrupted Djoka, "I was just about to find you. We'll stay here tonight, and tomorrow too. Trust me, this is the safest place." Then Charles turned to the soldiers and ordered, "Continue training. You need to learn how to cooperate with each other." Major Brownie shouted, "Did you hear Master Charles? Get moving. You guys, the Germans won't be polite to you, Yes, sir, the soldiers responded loudly and threw themselves into training. Djoka and Camille were stunned by this scene, frozen in place for a long time. Charles was actually giving them orders? These fierce-looking soldiers were actually obeying Charles's commands? Just a moment ago, the two of them were worried that the soldiers would harm Charles. Chapter 9 I'm betting everything on you winning. Tell me what's going on, Camille asked Charles nervously from the corner of the square. Are you going to lead these soldiers to fight the Germans? Don't be nervous, Mom, Charles reassured her. I'm just teaching them how to fight. I won't go to the battlefield, teaching them how to fight. Djoka and Camille exchanged glances. Charles had never left their side, nor had he ever participated in any training. How could he know how to teach others how to fight? Then Djoka seemed to understand. You're paying them to listen to you, right? You can't squander the tractor factory's funds like this, Charles. You're still in your probationary period. This is your first day at the tractor factory. Charles didn't know how to answer. He knew that no matter how he explained, Djoka and Camille wouldn't believe that he could command these soldiers with just his silver tongue. Camille glanced at the menacing soldiers in the square, a chill running down her spine. All right, let's go back first. We'll talk about it when we get home. No, Mom, Charles said. We can't get out. What do you mean? Camille asked, puzzled. Charles replied, for secrecy, entry to the tractor factory is permitted after sunset, but exit is not. Djoka was furious. This is a Bernard family factory. What right do they have to allow entry but not exit? He assumed it was a rule set by French soldiers. Father, Charles interrupted Djoka. This is my order. Djoka stared, dumbfounded. Your order, Camille repeated Charles's words with difficulty. She vaguely remembered that there were indeed several soldiers with rifles standing guard at the tractor factory gate. She didn't care about secrecy, nor did she care about entry but not exit. She simply couldn't imagine that her son, who had always been harmless and bullied, could suddenly command others, or rather, raise an army and control the entire factory in just one day. Djoka looked around, half believing, and asked, what military secrets are involved here? I can't say. Charles repeated his earlier words. I can only say that this is the safest place. We should stay here. Djoka nodded helplessly at Camille, as if to say, this is what I told you this morning. Our child has grown up, and is even smarter than Francis. At the 6th Army headquarters in Paris, Gallieri slammed his fist on his desk, roaring, this is ignorance. This is murder. This is a crime. Gallieri was furious for only one reason. General Joffre had rejected his suggestion to command the 6th Army in an attack on the German flank. The situation is obvious, Gallieni said, his face ashen. The German 1st Army has advanced deep into enemy territory, leaving the 2nd Army 20 kilometers behind. Now they've changed their attack direction and are stepping into our encirclement. If we don't attack, we might lose this golden opportunity. Major General Monnery dared not utter a word. Gallieni was right. The German 2nd Army would catch up in just 2 days, at which point the Germans would have enough troops to besiege Paris again. Or, the German 1st Army might suddenly realize its mistake and return to its original attack route, with unimaginable consequences. Everyone was puzzled as to why Joffre had refused to attack. Gallieri paced anxiously at his desk, hands behind his back. After a while, he angrily questioned his staff officer. What explanation did he, referring to Joffre, give? The staff officer replied tremblingly. General Joffre believes the Germans are unlikely to have left such a large opening. It's probably a trap, designed to lure the 6th Army out of Paris's defenses before launching a surprise attack. So we should wait and see, Gallieri snorted, interrupting the staff officer. He didn't want to hear any more. Gallieri mentally reviewed the whole process. In some ways, Joffre's judgment made sense. The biggest question was who spread the rumors. If the rumors were the Germans' doing, intended to give the 1st Army a sufficient reason to change its marching route, ultimately tricking France into luring the 6th Army out of Paris. No, the Germans had no reason to do that. Gallieri said, the Germans only need to follow the normal marching route to encircle Paris from the west, cut off their supply lines, and wait for the 2nd Army to arrive to achieve victory. Why go through all this trouble? Major General Monnery nodded in agreement. But now, without General Joffre's orders, nothing could be done. Gallieri had a vague feeling that Joffre's actions were driven by personal grudges. Gallieri and Joffre were bitter enemies, having argued publicly on numerous occasions, sometimes even slamming their fists on the table and shouting insults. Today, It was Glieri who discovered the Germans' weakness and promptly suggested an attack. If Joffre immediately agreed, wouldn't it mean that Joffre, as the commander-in-chief, was commanding according to Glieri's battle plan? Would the hero who defeated the Germans become Glieri, not Joffre? Would that be an admission that Joffre was inferior to Glieri? Glieri's eyelids twitched. He didn't voice this thought. After all, it was just speculation without evidence. Glieri gritted his teeth and ordered, "Prepare the vehicles. If needed, we can get the troops to the battlefield in the shortest time, General." Major General Manuri replied hesitantly, "Most of our vehicles have already been sent to the battlefield, then requisition other vehicles, ox carts, horse-drawn carriages, taxis." Glieri emphasized, "Any kind will do. We must be prepared. This concerns the fate of France." "Yes, General," Major General Manuri answered promptly. At the Darvas tractor factory, the electric lights used for illumination had been turned off, plunging the square into darkness. Charles finally finished the soldiers' training, letting them go home for a comfortable bath. They needed to conserve their energy for tomorrow's battle, not exhaust themselves with a whole night of training. Brownie took off his mudcake military cap and sat down next to Charles, saying in a low voice, "They said the Germans are coming this way. I thought they wouldn't keep chasing us." Charles grunted in agreement, thinking to himself, if Brownie knew this was a setup by Charles to lure the Germans here, would Brownie beat him up in anger? "All that stuff you've been making?" Brownie nodded towards the tractor in the corner of the square. "Are you sure it'll work?" If the Germans were focusing their attack on the machine gun factory, they would have sent at least several thousand men, right? Did this kid not know that? Could this thing really defeat several thousand Germans? "Don't worry, Major." Charles glanced towards the dormitory and said, "My family is here. I'm betting everything on you winning." Major Brownie gave a bitter laugh. He felt crazy for believing a teenager and doing all this absurd stuff according to his wishes. Major Brownie looked up at the sky, gazing at the countless stars, and sighed inwardly, "This world is beautiful. I wonder if I'll be able to sit here and look at the stars again tomorrow." Chapter 10 These damn liars. A cold wind howled, and autumn leaves fell. The temperature in France in September had dropped to 8 degrees Celsius, making it quite chilly. General von Kluck, commander of the German First Army, hid in the grass, observing the town of Darvas across the Marne River shrouded in morning mist through binoculars. As he expected, French soldiers were indeed constructing fortifications along the river. The only bridge nearby was heavily fortified, several machine guns were positioned at the bridgehead, 2 layers of trenches were built, and several hundred men were stationed there. One could vaguely see someone installing explosives, so that the bridge could be destroyed if the defenses failed. A sneer appeared on Kluck's lips. These fools, did they really think he would launch a frontal assault across the river? Kluck turned slightly and whispered to the staff officer lying beside him, "Where's the 1st Regiment located, General?" The staff officer checked his pocket watch and replied, "If nothing unexpected happens, they will arrive at their designated location within 20 minutes. Kluck grunted in acknowledgement and immediately ordered, "Prepare for battle, prepare for battle, prepare for battle." The orders were relayed one after another. Densely packed with German soldiers in the grass, they calmly and orderly checked their equipment, some even attaching bayonets to their rifles. These were the vanguard, likely to engage the enemy in hand-to-hand combat immediately. After issuing the orders, Kluck waited quietly for the 1st Regiment to appear. The 1st Regiment, numbering over 4,000, was an elite force personally trained by Kluck. This unit often played the role of the spearhead in battle, leading the charge. They had crossed the Marne River under cover of darkness the previous night, flanking the enemy's lines. Their missions were twofold: first, to seize the bridge swiftly to cover the main forces crossing, and second, to capture the machine gun factory located west of the town of Darvas. Kluck was confident in this battle plan because he knew the fighting strength of the French army from his experience fighting all the way here. The problem with the French army wasn't the army itself; their soldiers and officers were brave. However, it was an army controlled by greedy banking capitalists. These capitalists only knew how to bleed the military and civilians dry. They were unwilling to import advanced foreign equipment. For example, the Maxim machine gun was refused use. This wasn't about national pride, but about monopolizing arms and making more money without competition. Despite its frequent malfunctions, unreliability, and exorbitant price, the Saint-Étienne machine gun became the Army's standard-issue machine gun. Even the Hotchkiss, produced by private companies, was better. Note, The Saint-Étienne machine gun was actually a copy of the Hotchkiss, but with many complex and malfunction-prone mechanisms added to avoid patent infringement. Ironically, these capitalists, who normally leeched off the French military and civilians, abandoned them completely in wartime, using them as shields. For whom did the French soldiers fight? To protect these capitalists? Was it to ensure the capitalists lived to a ripe old age so they could continue to enslave them? Germany was different. For unification and strength, 80% of Germany's national income was allocated to military development. From Wilhelm I onwards, the kings wanted to spend every penny on the army. His coronation ceremony cost only 2,547 silver coins. A previous German coronation cost 5 million silver coins. German soldiers knew why they fought, knew their blood would not be shed in vain, and knew the meaning of sacrificing their lives on the battlefield. Such an army was invincible. "General," the staff officer whispered to Kluck, "they've arrived." Kluck raised his binoculars and looked upstream on the Marne River. Sure enough, he saw black cloth fluttering above a building. That was the signal from the 1st Regiment, meaning arrived at designated position, ready. Kluck nodded slightly, then gave the order in a low, cold voice, "Prepare." He drew out the words to allow the soldiers time to prepare, then his tone immediately hardened. "Attack." The staff officer suddenly stood up, waved behind him, and shouted, "Attack." German soldiers roared as they emerged from the bushes. The once empty jungle was suddenly teeming with men, a dense mass covering the hillsides. They wore spiked helmets, gripped rifles, and stared fiercely at the French lines opposite them. On the other side of the Marne, the French soldiers who had been chatting and building fortifications were instantly terrified by the German onslaught. They turned pale and froze, only reacting when the gunfire erupted. They screamed and scrambled into the trenches. "The Germans," the French colonel shouted, "they're here." "Stay calm." His voice trembled. Everyone could tell that even the colonel himself was struggling to remain calm. Bang! Bang! A sparse barrage of gunfire rang out, the French soldiers firing. Machine guns roared in response, volleys of bullets whistling through the air towards the German troops on the opposite bank. The French colonel was exasperated. Before he could even give the order, these men were already out of control with nervous anticipation. But now the gunfire was in full swing, and ordering a halt was impossible. The French colonel could only frantically command, "Fire! Fire!" However, no one, including the French colonel, realized they had fallen into a German trap. Anyone with a clear head should have known that a forced crossing by the Germans was impossible. The bridge could be destroyed at any moment, the river was cold and deep, and although only 70 meters wide, troops entering the river would become slow-moving sitting ducks. Clearly, the German frontal attack was intended to draw their fire and attention. At this moment, the French soldiers should have been more concerned with their flanks than their front. But no one was on guard. Almost everyone was terrified by the sudden appearance of the Germans. They frantically pulled the bolts of their rifles, mechanically exchanging fire with the enemy across the river, their minds blank, seemingly afraid that the Germans would leap across the river to them. Suddenly, a burst of intense gunfire erupted on the left flank. The French colonel's face turned pale instantly. Only then did he realize the Germans' true intentions. He peeked out and, sure enough, saw the Germans on the flank of the defensive line. The French soldiers on the flank, caught off guard, crumbled at the first touch. They were either killed or abandoned their trenches and fled in panic. Most realized they couldn't escape and crouched down, raising their hands in surrender. The French colonel remained somewhat calm. He shouted, "Destroy the bridge! Destroy the..." Bang! A gunshot rang out. A bullet pierced the colonel's head, his head tilting to one side at an unnatural angle. Then, his entire body slumped to the ground like a deflated balloon. He should have known that the Germans had prepared many snipers to successfully capture the bridge, and their targets were these officers who were giving orders. The French soldiers at this point were unsure whether to blow up the bridge. They thought, the Germans have already crossed the river, what's the point of blowing up the bridge? Escaping is the priority. Soon, the entire French defensive line retreated towards the town of Darvest, their red caps and trousers making them look like a red tide. The bridge fell intact into German hands, and the main German force surged along it into the south bank of the Marne. Standing on the rooftop of his villa, watching all this, Francis cursed, "These bastards, so utterly pathetic. Where is General Gard? Where is General Gard?" Major General Gard was the commander of the 5th Army. Francis had been having pleasant conversations with General Gard these past few days, treating him to the finest wines and beef, along with 2 beautiful maids, providing impeccable service to make Major General Guard feel right at home. Major General Guard assured Francis more than once, "Don't worry, Mr. Francis, with a Marne line in place, the Germans can't possibly attack." "I assure you, sir," the butler replied in a panic, "I just saw Major General Guard leave in a car, with Mr. Pierre." Francis felt a chill run through him. It was all over. The factory, the family, fame and fortune, everything. These damned liars. Chapter 11. What kind of monster is this? After a moment's hesitation, Francis asked again, "Where is Charles? Has he left with his family?" "No, sir," the butler replied. "They're at the tractor factory." Without a word, Francis headed towards the tractor factory, his silver cane tucked under his arm. The butler followed, pleading, "Sir, the Germans are right there. They've already attacked. The tractor factory is dangerous. Going there now is like walking into a trap. We should leave immediately." But Francis completely ignored him. He strode down the stairs and headed straight for the tractor factory, his pace quickening until the butler had to run to keep up. Francis wasn't worried about Charles's safety, he just wanted to hear Charles's explanation before the Germans occupied the tractor factory. This arrogant, conceited little fellow had made him gamble everything, and now he had nothing left. Entering the tractor factory, Francis immediately spotted Djoka and Camille, embracing and facing the square, occasionally startled by the gunfire and screams emanating from outside the wall. "Where's Charles?" Francis asked, approaching. "Father." Djoka was initially surprised to see Francis, but quickly noticed his grim expression. He hesitated briefly before realizing his father was angry with Charles. Djoka was enraged. He gently pushed Camille aside and stood expressionlessly in front of Francis. "This has nothing to do with Charles, father. Everything was your decision." Francis shoved Djoka aside, and the scene before him stunned him. Charles stood calmly on the square stands, peering through binoculars at the outside of the wall, occasionally issuing commands to those below. Below, hundreds of fully armed French soldiers were gathered, divided into a dozen or so small groups, each with a metal canister in front of it. "What are those?" Francis asked curiously, staring at the iron cans. "I don't know," Djoka said. "Charles said they can protect us, and the factory." Francis sneered. He recognized the tracks. Those iron cans were modified tractors, only now they were encased in steel plates, and smoke was billowing from the exhaust pipes. Clearly they were already running and ready to go. "He thinks he's Napoleon," Francis judged Charles, "with these modified tractors," but Francis didn't go forward. He wanted to see what else this little guy could do. Charles acted quite maturely, shouting like a commander, "Hold your ground, hold your ground, attack!" The iron cans thudded forward slowly, and the French soldiers following behind also moved, gripping their rifles tightly, splitting into 2 groups and slowly following. There were 12 iron cans in total. The 9 in front advanced in a straight line, while the 3 behind followed slowly, seemingly intentionally creating distance. This was Charles's decision. He divided the tanks into 4 groups of 3. The first 3 groups spearheaded the attack on the enemy formation, while the last group served as a reserve, ready to reinforce or respond to any unforeseen circumstances. For example, if the flanks were outflanked and a gap needed to be filled, having a reserve force was crucial for victory. The iron cans rattled towards the wall, then with a bang, easily pushed it down. Their tracks crushed the broken bricks, raising their wedge-shaped fronts, and they appeared imposingly before the charging German soldiers. The German soldiers, who had been riding high on their victory and pursuing the French army, were instantly stunned by this sight, their momentum faltering. "God, what is that? Is it there?" Referring to France's secret weapon, "We've fallen into the enemy's trap. They deliberately lured us here." It's human nature to fear the unknown, and fear leads to wild speculation. This speculation results in unease and negative rumors spreading rapidly through the ranks. Many soldiers even unconsciously took their steps backward, gripping their rifles but forgetting to fire. This unit was the elite of the First Army, known as the 1st Steel Regiment, commanded by Colonel Jonas. Colonel Jonas was in the middle of the unit when he noticed the unusual movement ahead and quickly led his guards forward. They saw several iron cans rumbling across the ruins and onto the flat ground. Without hesitation, Colonel Jonas shouted, "Attention! Raise your weapons! Destroy them!" Under his powerful command, the German soldiers mustered their courage, raised their rifles, and aimed at the slowly approaching monsters. At this moment, The German soldiers' discipline shone through. Even terrified by the monsters, no one fired recklessly but waited for the colonel's order. Fire, bang, 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 dot. A dense hail of bullets flew towards the monster, but an astonishing scene unfolded. The bullet struck the monster, producing only a few sparks, and after a series of clanging sounds, the monster was completely unharmed. The German soldiers were all stunned, staring blankly at the thing before them. Most of them were thinking about one question: if bullets were ineffective, how could they eliminate it? With bayonets? Or with the spikes on their helmets? Colonel Jonas was no less shocked than his soldiers, but his long combat experience and officer's qualities allowed him to suppress his panic and continue to give the order in a low voice: "Raise your rifles." The German soldiers mechanically cocked their rifles and aimed them at the monster again, but many were pale and sweating, while others nervously swallowed. Fire, bang, bang, bang. This time the gunfire was more synchronized than before. They hoped to inflict as much damage as possible on the monster through this simultaneous barrage. But it was still no use. The bullets only left small white dents on the monster, like raindrops hitting a smooth beach. The monster continued to approach them slowly, emitting strange roars. Charles, watching coldly through his binoculars from the stands, knew the Germans' efforts were doomed. At a distance of about 200 meters, even vertical armor couldn't be penetrated by 9mm steel plates, let alone the sloped armor at the front of the tank. Camille froze, and after a long pause, she grabbed Joka's hand and exclaimed, "Joka, did you see that? It worked. Unbelievable, it really worked." Camille's gaze turned to Charles, her eyes filled with surprise and pride. "He's amazing." She unconsciously moved towards Charles, but Joka stopped her. "No, Camille, the battle isn't over yet. We can't disturb him." Camille immediately realized, and an embarrassed smile bloomed on her tear-streaked face. "You're right, I almost did something wrong." As she spoke, her eyes remained fixed on Charles, repeatedly saying, "He's our son. Our son." Francis watched the astonishing scene on the battlefield, his expression uncertain. Could this little guy have already thought of using this thing to hold off the Germans when he was urging him to risk everything? If so, his foresight and cunning were terrifying. Then the battlefield took a new turn. The machine gun in front of the Iron Can roared, bullets rat-a-tat-tat shooting at the German soldiers, and the French soldiers hiding behind it also leaned out one by one to fire at the German soldiers. Chapter 12. You saved France. Blood splattered, screams filled the air. German soldiers fell like harvested wheat, but with Colonel Jonas commanding the ranks, none dared to flee. They could only lie on the ground, their eyes filled with terror and pleading as they looked at the colonel, as if to say, "Order a retreat, sir, we can't handle it." But Colonel Jonas knew he had no way out. Behind them lay the Marne River, and the only bridge was surely crowded with people, the main force of the First Army surging across it like a tide. If he ordered a retreat, the soldiers of the 1st Regiment would either be trapped on the bridge or forced into the river. Neither option was good, both would lead to the annihilation of the 1st Regiment. Therefore, Colonel Jonas had no choice but to hold on. He gritted his teeth and ordered in a hoarse voice, "Hold on, take up your weapons, whatever they are, and fire at it." This was the only order Colonel Jonas could give, the only order he could think of. Since the start of the war, or rather, since he came into this world, he had never felt such despair. It seemed there was no way to deal with it, only to wait for death. German bullets still couldn't penetrate the monster, while the machine gun on its head relentlessly spat fire, bullets falling row upon row of German soldiers, standing and crouching, firing from all angles. The monster's machine gun fired in a sweeping pattern, while the French soldiers peeking out from behind it fired with precision, a combination of point and area fire that left the German soldiers horribly wounded. Even lying prone was useless for the German soldiers. The surrounding area was open, offering no cover, and bullets flew in from every direction, striking their legs, bodies, and heads. The German spiked helmets were made of leather and offered no protection. Hitting the French soldiers was nearly impossible for the Germans. They hid behind the monster using it as a shield, suddenly emerging to fire, then immediately retreating to pull the bolt, giving the German soldiers only a few seconds to react. In despair, Colonel Jonas suddenly remembered the fortifications built by French soldiers along the Marne River, which might provide cover for his troops. Thinking this, Colonel Jonas shouted, "Retreat! Retreat to!" Before he could finish speaking, the German soldiers were already scrambling to their feet and running away. Colonel Jonas was shocked. His troops had never acted like this before. The order wasn't finished, and they were already retreating. This wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. Then Colonel Jonas realized the gravity of the situation. If they started running at the mere mention of retreat, did it mean the scenario he had feared, a collision with the main force, would occur? "Stop!" Colonel Jonas shouted frantically. "Stop everything!" But no one listened. The German soldiers' retreat was out of control. Colonel Jonas had overestimated the quality of his men, or rather, he had underestimated the power of fear. Everyone, including himself, was on the verge of collapse. At that moment, when Colonel Jonas shouted retreat, they surged forward like a burst dam, unstoppable. Colonel Jonas, left with no other option, could only retreat with his troops, shouting as he ran, "Organized defenses on the riverbank! Organized defenses on the riverbank!" Whoosh! A bullet pierced the air, striking Colonel Jonas in the back. His upper body lurched forward from the momentum, his lower limbs and arms flailing wildly to the sides. Time seemed to stand still at that moment. Colonel Jonas slowly fell face down to the ground, surrounded by the splattering dirt from bullets, the gushing blood from German soldiers, and the terrified eyes of wounded soldiers lying on the ground. With each sharp pain and the final thud of his heart, consciousness gradually faded from Colonel Jonas's mind. Charles was extremely satisfied with the battle. Seeing the German army retreating, he ordered the messenger waiting beside him, "Order the reserves to attack the bridge of Marne." "Yes, sir," the messenger responded excitedly. He was already bursting with excitement at the victory before him, regretting that he hadn't been there to witness this miracle. He waved the signal flag with great force, relaying orders to the troops at the front. Soon, the signal flag responded with "received," and 3 tanks as reserves, leading 3 squads of French soldiers, sped out from the flanks and charged towards the Pont de la Marne. Camille couldn't bear to watch the bloody scene, but she didn't want to abandon Charles and leave. She could only hide behind a building, hugging her arms and shivering in a corner, occasionally asking, "Have we won? Are we winning?" Djoka, watching the battlefield, excitedly replied, "Yes, we are winning, our soldiers are brave, over 300 men repelled thousands of Germans. No, it must be Charles's invention, it successfully helped the soldiers repel the Germans, the other soldiers are returning, we are counterattacking." Djoka was right. The French army had been retreating, but when they turned around, they were surprised to find that the Germans hadn't pursued them. Not only had they not pursued, but they had been routed and were fleeing in disarray. The French soldiers hesitated for a moment. Although they didn't understand what was happening and had no officers to command them, they knew they should counterattack. After all, no one would refuse victory, glory, and promotion. So they turned their guns and rejoined the battle. The outcome was already decided, the German defeat was only a matter of time. Francis gave a blank. He admitted that his initial assessment of Charles was wrong. This young man's military talent was comparable to Napoleon's, and he was far more reliable than that Major General Guard. Then a smile appeared on his face. The benefit he had gained was that everything was back. His family, 2 large factories including a machine gun production line, and countless honors and benefits. Finally, he focused his gaze on Charles, pondering how to position him. This young man's abilities far exceeded his imagination. Could he control this young man? Charles, oblivious to the stares of others, simply walked to Joseph beside the stands and reassured him, "It'll be all right, the battle is almost over." Joseph breathed a sigh of relief, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, Master Charles." Matthew was driving one of the iron cans on the battlefield. Joseph, intently watching the battlefield, sincerely praised Charles. "This is your strength, Master Charles. You commanded them to win this battle, you saved us all, perhaps including France." Charles calmly replied, "It's too early to say." Group number 961,296,310. Group name, Steel Wing Iron Cavalry. Welcome readers to join the discussion. Chapter 13, Offense and Defense. Matthew wasn't originally going to the battlefield. He wasn't in Charles's plans. Charles had already selected a dozen or so tractor drivers, a simple task for the tractor factory. However, when these drivers heard they would be driving tractors to the front lines, even taking the lead and shielding themselves from bullets, they turned pale with fright. "We're just drivers, Master Charles, not soldiers. We have families to support. We only earn 28 francs a month, barely enough to make ends meet." The implication was that it wasn't worth risking their lives for 28 francs. Charles had an urge to give them more money, but ultimately restrained himself. Charles understood that raising wages would create more problems later. French soldiers also risked their lives on the battlefield. They too had families to support, and their wages were even lower than workers. Shouldn't they be paid more? A full-strength army group had about 300,000 men, and at least 100,000 were assembled in Darvez. Could Charles afford to increase their wages? Therefore, it had to be voluntary, no extra pay was allowed. Just as Charles was in a dilemma, Matthew stepped forward. "Let me go." Charles refused without hesitation. "You're from the assembly line, we need skilled drivers. This is going to war, not a joke." Charles emphasized the latter part of his sentence, especially the word war. A hint of confusion flashed in Matthew's eyes, but he understood the next second. He stared at Charles with a half-smile and replied, word by word, "I've driven tractors like toys since I was a kid. Nobody in this factory is more skilled than me." Matthew raised an eyebrow meaningfully, as if to say, "You clearly know this." Charles did know, he just didn't want Matthew to take the lead. But at this point, Charles couldn't refuse any more, otherwise no one would be willing to take the risk. Seeing Charles's tacit approval, Matthew turned to the others and casually waved his hand. "Gentlemen, think about it. We might defeat the Germans, isn't that protecting our families? Have you really decided to kneel before the Germans and beg them not to kill your families or steal your things? Stand up, gentlemen, I don't want to live like that." Matthew's words were very persuasive. The drivers were silent for a moment, then one after another raised their hands. "Count me in, I'm going to try my luck. Maybe I can come back alive, and maybe even be one of the ones who defeated the Germans. I'll join. I have no family, it doesn't matter if I don't come back." And so, these ordinary yet great men went to the battlefield. They hadn't received any military training, driving untested, crudely made iron tanks, facing dozens of times more ferocious Germans and the dark muzzles of guns. Perhaps because the tanks had poor external perception, 2 iron tanks drove into the trenches one after another and got stuck, unable to move. Joseph suddenly tensed up. Could it be Matthew's iron tank? Charles cursed under his breath. He had warned them to be careful of the trenches long ago. These early tanks were completely incapable of crossing trenches. Their tracks could barely handle the muddy puddles and field ridges of the farm. The German soldiers noticed this as well. They seemed to have found a glimmer of hope, or perhaps it was a last-ditch effort. Some of them retreated into the trenches, attempting to reorganize their defenses. This demonstrated the German soldiers' discipline. Even at this point, some of them hadn't given up. However, reality was cruel, and their efforts soon vanished. One iron tank after another came to a stop in front of the trenches. They stopped advancing and instead aimed their machine guns at the German soldiers in sight at close range. The French soldiers following behind also used the iron tanks for cover, sniping at the German soldiers. They split into 2 groups, coordinating their attacks. After one group fired a shot, they retreated, and the other group immediately peeked out to fire. This was an asymmetrical battle. The trenches defended by the Germans were constructed by French soldiers, facing the opposite bank and still under construction. German soldiers had to crouch down to barely find cover. The French, however, had several massive shields in front, and their trenches were lined up one after another, leaving only a narrow passage a dozen feet wide in the middle. Any German soldier who deviated even slightly from this passage would have their firing angle blocked. Ultimately, the Germans could only acknowledge the outcome with heavy casualties. Soldiers fell one by one in the trenches, filled with regret and resentment. Those who stubbornly resisted mostly became corpses. Major Brownie shouted from behind the iron can, "Hold your ground. Maintain the line. Maintain the line." This was an incredible tactic, Major Brownie thought. Before this, the French army's tactics had always been attack, attack, and attack again. Whether an officer graduated from military academy was irrelevant, because everyone knew how to command and how to fight. French tactics were too monotonous. All commands could be summed up in one word: advance. Advance while the enemy holds the line. When the enemy retreats, we advance. When the enemy attacks, we still advance. It doesn't matter who commands. This cost the French army dearly from the very beginning of the war. Although Major Brown didn't know the exact number of casualties, what he saw, heard, and felt suggested that the number was certainly not small. Note, in August and September 1914, the number of French deaths, disappearances, and prisoners reached 164,500 per month. This led France to quickly lower the minimum conscription age to 18. By 1915, 80% of men aged 18 to 46 had been conscripted, but now, they appeared to be attacking Yet they were always on the defensive. To be precise, they were attacking while defending. They were constantly hiding behind their iron cans, slowly advancing towards the enemy under their cover. Then the enemy collapsed. A German elite force of several thousand men collapsed under the attack of just over 300 of them. This was unimaginable before. France would need at least tens of thousands of men to defeat this elite German force, while they only had a little over 300 men, plus a dozen or so tractors. Major Brownie roughly estimated that only about 20 men had been killed or wounded. "This is amazing," Major Brownie exclaimed while giving orders. "To hell with it. What have we been doing all this time? They've been wasting soldiers' lives. From now on, we should fight like this." The soldiers were greatly encouraged. As they fired at the enemy, they thought, the battles will be much easier now, and France will undoubtedly win. So, although the troops were few in number, their morale was high. And they fought with increasing ferocity. The terrified German soldiers kept retreating onto the bridge, while the main German force on the north bank of the Marne continued to charge along the bridge as ordered. The two forces collided violently like surging tides, and instantly, people were packed together so tightly that they couldn't move. Many were injured by falling spiked helmets, and others screamed as they were pushed off the bridge and into the river. "Drive them onto the bridge," Major Brownie shouted. "Machine gunners, aim at the enemy on the bridge." The machine guns roared in, firing indiscriminately without aiming, the bullets hitting their mark effortlessly. The French 8mm rifle bullets were incredibly powerful. If not for being jammed by bone, they could penetrate 3 bodies and kill a 4th. Amidst the intense gunfire, the Marne Bridge was engulfed in a bloodbath. The entire bridge was stained red, sticky blood seeped like streams from the edges and cracks, dripping into the Marne and turning the river a shocking crimson. Finally, the Germans realized the Marne Bridge was impassable, and they turned towards the Marne below. However, this was also not a good option. Chapter 14: The Inventor. The subsequent battle benefited from the counter-offensive of the main force of the French Fifth Army. Major Brownie's troops numbered only a little over 300 men. Even if they chased after several thousand German soldiers, they couldn't wipe them out quickly and risk being overwhelmed. This tactic of using tanks to cover infantry advances had a weakness. Once the German soldiers decided to counterattack the tank units and engage in hand-to-hand combat, the tanks would become useless. Fortunately, the German soldiers at this point didn't understand this. They were simply worried and afraid of being approached by these monsters, ultimately choosing to flee even with no way out. Then the main French force arrived. They were the kind of people who advocated attack, and more attack. Their usual training habits allowed them to cross the tank lines without hesitation and charge towards the German soldiers. Many glanced at the tanks with curiosity and fear as they passed them, only rushing towards the enemy after confirming they were their own equipment. Shouts, fighting, cries of pain, and sporadic gunfire filled the air. Bayonets, rifle butts, stones, everything was used. French and German soldiers were locked in fierce combat everywhere, easily distinguishable by the French soldiers' conspicuous red trousers. Charles was astonished that the Germans still possessed fighting power. The main French charge seemed to have been halted by a dam. This was no humiliating force. Without the support of tanks, the French would likely have suffered 10 times the casualties to defeat them. But it was still to no avail. The Germans could only hold their trench lines by a few hundred, while the French numbered in the tens of thousands, with reinforcements constantly arriving. The red tide of men quickly engulfed the Germans, obscuring their figures. The French soldiers who reached the riverbank raised their rifles again, suppressing German fire on the opposite bank while firing at the fleeing Germans in the middle of the river. Gunshots rang out, and German soldiers fell into the icy water. Most of them didn't even have time to scream, as their mouths were immediately filled with river water as they fell. The river was eerily still. No one knew whether they had been killed by bullets or drowned. Then the French set up machine guns, bullets skimming the water, leaving trails of blood. Corpses floated on the surface, drifting like dead fish, their blood staining the surrounding water a hazy red. Kluck watched all this with a grim face. He had thought victory was assured. The outcome was decided when the 1st Regiment successfully captured the bridgehead. However, the situation suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse. Before Kluck could even understand what was happening, the German army had collapsed and suffered a crushing defeat. What happened? Kluck asked, puzzled. Have enemy reinforcements arrived? Kluck hadn't noticed the iron cans on the riverbank. The staff didn't know what had happened either, but they knew what to do. A survivor was brought before Cluck. This was the highest-ranking officer the staff could find. This was a lieutenant, his face covered in mud and blood, seemingly injured. He trembled uncontrollably with fear, his breath coming in gasps. Cluck frowned, giving the lieutenant a disdainful look. An officer from the 1st Steel Regiment? What happened? Cluck asked coldly, barely suppressing the urge to drag the lieutenant away and execute him. General, the lieutenant replied in a trembling voice, the enemy has a new piece of equipment. It's impervious to bullets and blades. We can't penetrate it, but it can mow us down with its machine gun. The lieutenant glanced fearfully at the opposite bank of the river. Just then, a metalcan came into view. The lieutenant quickly pointed in that direction. It's there. That's it, the monster. Cluck raised his binoculars and looked in the direction the lieutenant indicated. Sure enough, he saw a strange object in the circle of light. Cluck's expression changed. What was that? How could it have turned the tide at the last moment? After a moment's thought, he ordered his staff officer, take him away and make him tell you everything he knows, every single detail, without missing a single word. Yes, General, the staff officer replied, simultaneously giving a signal to 2 soldiers. They understood and restrained the lieutenant, who was on the verge of collapse and madness. On the opposite bank, the French soldiers had completed their final cleanup. They cheered and waved to the last few German deserters, seemingly bidding them farewell, but more like showing off. In stark contrast were the gloomy faces of the German soldiers on the north bank. This was the first time the Germans had suffered such a defeat since the start of the war. The riverbank, the bridge, and the river itself were littered with the corpses of German soldiers. Conservative estimates put the loss at 4,000 or 5,000 men, all in this instant. What made it even more humiliating was that the French Fifth Army, which they had relentlessly pursued, was stationed on the opposite side. These former defeated foes had finally tasted the bitterness of defeat. Charles and Joseph rushed to the battlefield immediately, worried that Matthew might be one of the tanks trapped in the trenches. Being trapped meant a high chance of being flanked and riddled with bullets at close range by German soldiers. No joke. However, Charles and Joseph quickly relaxed, as they saw Matthew emerge from his tank amidst the cheers of the soldiers, proudly waving to the French troops. Matthew was always so flamboyant, he would boast and exaggerate every achievement he made. But he deserved it. He's all right, Charles breathed a sigh of relief. If anything had happened to Matthew, he wouldn't know how to explain it to Joseph. Joseph seemed to see through Charles's thoughts, and he said with some emotion, even if something happened, I won't hold it against you, Master Charles. He fled for France, it has nothing to do with you, and you saved us all. Suddenly, a soldier shouted, hey, that's Master Charles. He invented this iron contraption and helped us win this battle. Everyone turned to look at Charles, followed by an even louder cheer, as soldiers surged forward from all directions, vying to shake hands with him. It's an honor, Master Charles, thank you so much, you saved us, you saved this battle, you are our savior. The soldiers' demands were simple, they respected whoever could lead them to victory, because that often meant they would survive. Charles saw Major Brownie in the crowd, and they exchanged glances and nodded slightly. Before the battle, Charles had agreed with Major Brownie that Major Brownie would take over training, command, and combat duties. Major Brownie was initially reluctant. You clearly did this. Major Brownie's face was filled with anger. I won't steal your credit, Charles retorted. What do you think will happen if they find out I did this? Major Brownie paused, then immediately realized the problem. They might conscript you, even though you're still a minor. Yes, Charles said, I don't want that. So, Major Brownie nodded helplessly. All right, I'll do as you say. But if necessary, I'll return these honors to you. After a pause, Major Brownie added, I'll instruct my men to keep a consistent story. That's why someone shouted at Charles. He invented this iron contraption. Compared to the halo of inventing the iron contraption, Charles's military talent seemed insignificant. At the same time, Charles was quite willing to accept the title of inventor, especially since this invention had helped the military win a battle. This would give Charles a good reputation in France, thus helping him secure a place in the French military industry. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 15: A Promise is Made. At the 6th Army headquarters in Paris, Galleri was restless, like an ant on a hot plate. So far, all the intelligence he had received was bad news. The Germans have appeared in Darvaz and launched a strong attack. A secret German force crossed the river last night, successfully capturing the Pont de la Marne through a pincer movement. Our defenses have collapsed, and Major General Gard has retreated with a headquarters. Damn it, Galleri cursed. When it comes to fighting, you bastards run faster than anyone else. What retreat? It's clearly abandoning the troops and running away. Galleri had an urge to execute Major General Gard to stabilize the lines. Unfortunately, Galleri was only the military commander of Paris. The only troops he could command were the 6th Army stationed in Paris and the police force. The 5th Army was commanded by Joffre. At the same time, Galleri knew that Joffre wouldn't do that. High-ranking generals often had intricate connections with capitalists, some even being scions of powerful families. They were often only concerned with enjoying themselves and escaping. The 5th Army cannot fail, Galleri said anxiously, pacing back and forth. They're the only ones around Darwadi. If they collapse completely, the main French forces in Paris will be cut off by the Germans, and Paris will be practically surrounded. This was probably the plan of the German First Army. They believed they could easily break through the 5th Army's lines, thus inflicting heavy casualties on France while simultaneously encircling and dividing Paris. Galleri suddenly stopped in front of the map, his tone gradually turning somber. What is Joffre doing? Our chances are slipping away. We should immediately launch a pincer attack to stabilize the 5th Army's lines, otherwise, everything is over. Everything. Galleri slammed his fist into the location of Darwadi on the map, as if wishing to personally lead the charge and defeat the Germans there. He prayed in his heart, "Give the order, Joffre. For God's sake, we cannot lose this battle." At that moment, a staff officer who had answered the phone suddenly looked astonished, then stunned for a moment before bursting with elation. Ignoring the proper etiquette between subordinates and superiors, he shouted towards Galleri from a distance of several meters, "We've won, General." "We've won?" Galleri looked bewildered. He turned to the staff officer. "What did you say? What victory?" The others in the command post also stopped what they were doing and looked at the staff officer, completely baffled. All the defenses were collapsing. How could there be a victory? Even the army commander had fled with a command post. Who could have one? Those farmers with hoes and sticks? The staff officer, excitedly stammering, "It was a major named Brownie." "No, it should be a major named Charles. He's the key point. They say he invented a weapon." Galleri puffed out his chest and angrily rebuked the staff officer. "Speak clearly, Major. Otherwise, I'll kick you out of here." The command post didn't need such incompetent fools. "Yes, General." The staff officer swallowed hard, trying to remain calm, but his chest was still heaving. He took a few seconds to organize his thoughts before reporting. It was a man named Charles who invented a device using a tractor. Major Brownie led his 300-plus men, relying on this device to launch a counterattack at a crucial moment and achieve victory. The command post fell silent instantly. Even the typewriters stopped. The typist wearing glasses looked up, staring at the staff officer through his lenses with a shocked expression, as if to say, "How could this happen? Is this some kind of novel?" Galleri's mustache trembled slightly with excitement, but he still couldn't believe it was true. He asked hesitantly, "Has the intelligence been confirmed?" "Confirmed." The staff officer waved the telephone in his hand and nodded firmly. "The Germans have been driven to the north bank of the Marne. They have lost at least 5,000 men," a cheer erupted in the command post. Some communications soldiers even excitedly threw documents into the air, and scraps of paper flew everywhere. Galleri asked again, "What kind of equipment is that?" "Enough for 300 men to defeat thousands of Germans." "I don't know, General," the staff officer replied. They couldn't explain it clearly over the phone. "It's something like a metal can. They call it a tank." "Tank?" Galleri looked bewildered. It was a completely unfamiliar word. He couldn't imagine what it was. Galleri decided to put it aside for now, his tone tinged with relief. "The person who invented this equipment, you said his name was?" "His name is Charles, General." Galleri nodded. "Which unit is he in?" "We should give him the greatest reward?" "No, General," the staff officer replied. "He's a 17-year-old boy, not belonging to any unit." Galleri was stunned. A 17-year-old boy invented a tank, and then saved France. How could it sound so unreal? "Oh, right," the staff officer added, It's that businessman who sponsored us, named Francis, and Charles is his youngest grandson." Gallery was stunned, sponsoring the Fifth Army to lead the troops to Darwaz, then spreading rumors that lured the German army to Darwaz, and finally inventing the tank to defeat the Germans. Were these all coincidences? If not coincidences, Gallery had a vague feeling that he wasn't the one fighting this war, but an unseen hand behind the scenes. While Gallery and his men were busy, Charles finally managed to escape the enthusiasm of the French soldiers. When he got home, he thought something had happened, as he was surrounded by people. When they saw Charles, they exclaimed, "It's Master Charles, Master Charles is back." They made way for him, leading to the small courtyard in front of the house. Djokovic and Camille were bustling about, greeting everyone. The doorway was already piled high with things: flour, eggs, cheese, fruit. Sile, Camille, the mother, stood on tiptoe and waved to Seal across the crowd, her face beaming with excitement and pride. "The neighbors brought you gifts. They're so kind." Seal took off his baseball cap and walked away, nodding humbly as he went. Thank you everyone." His polite and proper manners immediately earned him a round of praise. "What a thoughtful child, we should be thanking you, Master Seal. You saved us all, we're so proud of you, you're our hero." A fat boy was shoved in front of Seal by his parents. Seal recognized him. His name was Teddy, a classmate who used to bully him. If it weren't for Matthew, Seal might not be alive today. "Apologize to Master Seal." His father grabbed Teddy by the back of his collar, like he was a prisoner. Teddy seemed terrified, but not because of his father. He looked up in terror, his eyes darting around, unable to meet Charles's gaze, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. Charles, you wouldn't use that iron can against me, would you?" Charles laughed. "Of course not, Teddy. It's for dealing with enemies." Then he turned to the surrounding neighbors, raising his head. "Our guns will always be pointed at enemies, not friends." The neighbors cheered. "That's right, Master Charles. Well done, Master Charles." Teddy relaxed, giving Charles a grateful look. "We are friends." Charles nodded firmly. "Of course. Thank you, Charles." Teddy's eyes reddened, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." Then his eyes lit up, and he leaned forward, whispering, "I can introduce you to Ada." Ada was Teddy's older sister, 3 years older than him. She was voluptuous and youthful, the object of admiration and discussion among many of her peers, including Charles and other teenagers entering puberty. Unfortunately, Ada overheard Teddy's words. "Teddy!" Ada cried out, pushing through the crowd and stepping forward with a murderous glare. She glanced at Charles, her eyes filled with panic and embarrassment. Realizing something was wrong, Teddy immediately broke free from his father's grasp and ran away as fast as he could, tossing back a message, "See you later, Charles." "I keep my word," Charles replied half-jokingly. "It's a deal." The neighbors burst into laughter, and Ada blushed, pretending to chase after Teddy. Chapter 16, The Little Daily News. Dinner was stewed beef with white beans, which used to be Charles's favorite. Now, Charles found it ordinary, thinking it should have more Sichuan peppercorns, chili peppers, light soy sauce, and dark soy sauce. His mother, Camille, hummed a song as she chopped vegetables in the kitchen. Djoka, chewing on his beef, remarked to Charles, "Your mother has never been happier." Camille placed a plate of fruit on the table, then sat between them with her own stewed beef, saying proudly, "Shouldn't we be happy? Our Charles has become a hero." Djoka's eyes gleamed with amusement as he looked at Charles. "I'm a little curious, Charles, how did you come up with a thing called a tank?" "It's simple," Charles replied, still eating his food. "I just wanted something to stop bullets in front of me, and since we had a tractor, I thought of doing it this way." Djoka nodded slightly. It did sound simple, but every new thing exists in the darkness of the unknown before it is invented, so it wasn't simple at all. Camille affectionately patted Charles's head. "Charles is a genius, only he could have thought of that." At that moment, she only had eyes for Charles. She felt her whole world had changed. The ostracism from the Bernard family, the cold stares from the townspeople, the bitterness of being caught in the middle, only she could understand. Now, all of that had vanished. It was all because of Charles, her son. Djokovic considered a problem and said to Camille, "Tomorrow we should go see father." Camille nodded readily. Of course, in Camille's view, Charles had made such a great contribution, Francis should undoubtedly acknowledge Charles, even their family, and confidently hand over the tractor factory to Charles. But a hint of worry appeared in Djokovic's eyes. He knew his father. His father was a controlling and proud man. He enjoyed being high above others and was not fond of being controlled or having things out of his control, especially not by anyone surpassing him, particularly family members. Charles was indeed excellent, but he was too excellent. His current prominence had overshadowed Francis, which was not a good thing. Charles seemed to read Joca's mind and reassured him, "Don't worry, father. Before we go to see Mr. Francis, I think we should go to Paris first." Paris? Joca was puzzled for a moment, but he quickly understood and nodded slightly in agreement. The Paris City Hall is located on the banks of the Seine, north of Notre Dame Cathedral in the heart of Paris. The original building was destroyed in the fires of the Paris Commune in 1871, and the current building is a reconstruction, completed in 1882. The building retains the style of the European Renaissance, with its staggered flat-roofed pyramid-shaped roofs and 136 statues on the walls, all depicting famous figures from French history. When Joca and Charles entered the office area, it was already 10 o'clock in the morning. The vast office was bustling with people, the noise of telephones and typewriters rising and falling, and some people seemed to be arguing with staff about tax issues. In contrast, the window for processing industrial property rights was quite deserted. Industrial property rights are essentially the modern equivalent of patented inventions. Most inventions during this period stemmed from industrial production, and industrial property rights were established to distinguish them from literary and artistic property rights, copyright. Behind the window sat a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, wearing glasses and sitting with his legs crossed, leisurely sipping coffee while reading the Le Petit Journal, a lewd smile occasionally playing on his lips. Those in the know understood. The Le Petit Journal, known at this time in France as a penny newspaper, was often published in a vulgar and erotic style to attract readers from the lower classes. "Hello, sir." Joca leaned forward to the window, speaking politely. "We're here to apply for industrial property rights." The man glanced at Joca, impatiently handed him a form, and immediately refocused on the newspaper. Joca filled out the form diligently, occasionally asking Charles for his opinion, while the man completely ignored them, taking a sip of coffee, turning the newspaper over, and continuing his search for new highlights. Charles was surprised to find that the front-page headline of the little daily was, "Tractors Save France." The article also included a cartoon-style illustration of a tractor converted into a tank, which, while not entirely accurate, was plausible. This was a major reason why the little daily only needed one reporter. It didn't require on-site reporting, only drawing based on imagination. Soon the forms were filled out, and both Joca and Charles were unsure if they were filled out correctly. Neither of them had experience. Joca, head bowed, handed the form through the window, saying, "Sir, would you please check if this is appropriate?" The Mediterranean-looking man grunted in agreement, put down his coffee, took the form, still reluctant to put down the newspaper, seemingly able to multitask while reviewing the form. However, Charles underestimated his professional abilities. He glanced at the form and froze, as if frozen in shock. Tank. He looked at Djokovic, then at Charles, who was only slightly taller than the bartender, and asked with difficulty, "From Darvist, Mr. Charles?" Charles nodded. "Yes, I am Charles." The Mediterranean man jumped up, nervously flipping through the newspaper to glance at the headline, then hurriedly put it down. He rummaged around on his desk for a while before finding a pen and notebook, muttering, "God, I'm so sorry, Mr. Charles, and this." The Mediterranean man turned his gaze to Djokovic. Djokovic introduced himself, his face beaming with pride. "I am his father." Djokovic gave Charles a meaningful look, as if to say, "It seems your news has already reached Paris." Charles shrugged slightly. Darvist was only a dozen kilometers from Paris, and Paris was the political, economic, and transportation center. If the news hadn't reached here by then, it was probably just unnecessary gossip. Mr. Joca, the Mediterranean-looking man strode out from the side door, a complete change from his previous nonchalant demeanor. He shook hands with Joca and Charles respectfully and with a radiant expression, then stepped aside and gestured towards the VIP room. "This way, gentlemen." The VIP room had sofas, a coffee table, a safe, and several pots of irises, symbols of light and freedom. Charles found it somewhat ironic. Were only VIPs entitled to enjoy light and freedom? Otherwise, were they destined to face the sullen faces of the staff at the counter? The Mediterranean-looking man entered a moment later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Sorry to keep you waiting. My name is Manuel, and it's my pleasure to process your industrial property rights." He carefully placed the form Joka had filled out on the table. The form is mostly correct, but it would be best to publish the property rights in the newspaper. This way, the date can be noted, which will be good evidence in case of any future disputes. That's it. Charles was somewhat surprised. No need for a search? Yes, the Mediterranean-looking man nodded. Except for a few details, Charles later learned that at that time, France did not handle industrial property rights searches. If there were duplicates or theft, the only solution was litigation. That's why the Mediterranean-looking man suggested publishing in the newspaper to leave more direct, powerful, and unforgeable evidence. The Mediterranean-looking man chatted casually with Joka about the details, and Charles had a feeling he was stalling for time. Charles's guess was correct. A dozen minutes later, a middle-aged man wearing a bowler hat and a suit appeared hurriedly at the VIP room door, leaning on a cane. "Let me introduce you," the Mediterranean-looking man breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing the middle-aged man. "This is Mr. Bonnet, the owner of the Little Daily News. He'd like to discuss the purchase of the tank property rights with you." Joka's expression changed. He realized the Mediterranean-looking man was deliberately stalling him. Charles, meanwhile, scoffed inwardly. One of the 200 families had come knocking so quickly. Chapter 17. Why should we sell your money tree? Bonnet was somewhat smug. As the owner of Le Petit Journal, his advantage lay in his excellent network of information. He received news of tanks appearing on the battlefield the moment they appeared, even minutes before Gallieni. While Gallieni had to go through several intermediaries to obtain military intelligence, Bonnet's intelligence came directly from the battlefield. He had an agreement with many mid to low-ranking officers in the army. Whoever provided the most valuable intelligence first would receive a high reward. Even as tanks were still charging towards the enemy, someone would call the Le Petit Journal office to describe the situation in detail. The article was quickly produced, embellishing the truth with pictures, and after review and typesetting, it was rushed to print that night and appeared on the streets the next morning. Other newspapers were still in a state of confusion, unaware of what was happening. Le Journal de la Méridien still believed France was about to lose the war. Bonnet smiled slightly. No wonder Le Petit Journal sold 1 million copies a day. In France, with a population of less than 40 million, what did it mean for a newspaper to sell 1 million copies a day? Aside from those who were illiterate and unaccustomed to reading newspapers, almost everyone had a copy of the Little Daily in their hands. Now, thanks to his informants, he intercepted Charles, who was applying for industrial property rights. "Gentlemen," Bonnet took off his coat and hat, handing them, along with his cane, to Manuel. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Bonnet's secret to success was being as polite as possible. He believed it was the cheapest investment, gaining respect, intelligence, and business without spending a centenary. Why not? Note, centenary is the French subunit of currency. 1 franc equals 20 sous equals 100 centenaries. He sat down opposite the two men, took out a cigar from his pocket, and offered it to de Joka, politely asking, "Would you like one, Mr. de Joka?" No, de Joka refused, a hint of hostility in his eyes. Charles, however, seemed indifferent. He appeared to have anticipated this. No joke, this was a tank, a weapon capable of changing the course of war. How could capitalists not sense its value? Charles hadn't expected them to arrive so quickly. This guy's intelligence network was probably even more sophisticated than the French intelligence agency. Bonnet didn't light a cigar himself. He raised an eyebrow and then put it back in his pocket. He didn't want to appear arrogant, as that wouldn't do business. "Relax, gentlemen," Bonnet smiled amicably. "I'm just here to talk business. I want to buy, and you have the right not to sell, that's all, Mr. Bonnet." Joka didn't lower his guard. He asked directly, "If you had a money tree, would you sell it?" This hit the nail on the head. Charles owned the tank industry, and the Bernard family had a tractor factory. They could simply convert tractors into tanks and sell them to the military or the state, a highly profitable venture. Why would they sell it to you? If they were to buy it, how much would you have to pay for this money tree? Bonnet nodded slightly. He seemed to have already considered this question. Not fighting unprepared battles was another key to his success. "Do you think it's that easy?" Bonnet retorted calmly. "What do you mean?" Joka narrowed his eyes, his tone becoming more aggressive. He perceived a threat in Bonnet's words. "I want to remind you, Mr. Bonnet, that if you want to use underhanded tactics, you'll be facing the Bernard family, while not one of the 200 families. The Bernard family held considerable reputation and influence in France due to their tractor business, making them not easily dealt with. No, you misunderstand me, Bonnet explained. You should know about the Maxim machine gun, right? Joka nodded blankly. What does that have to do with us? Bonnet continued. Everyone knows the Maxim machine gun is excellent, better than the machine guns we use now, but why doesn't the French army equip it? Because it wasn't invented in France. Joka didn't think much of it. Bonnet smiled knowingly and asked, is that so? Then Joka understood, it was just an excuse used by the bank capitalists to deceive the people. The real reason was that the bank capitalists wouldn't make money by introducing the Maxim machine gun. Seeing that Joka had figured this out, Bonnet continued the topic. They control the army, Mr. Joka, so of course they can decide what the army buys. If they want, you might not sell a single tank. After all, who would buy tanks besides the army, right? Joka was stunned. Things did seem to be as Bonnet said. After all, even a machine gun factory needed government authorization, and the government was controlled by them. However, Joka still didn't believe it, but tanks can help the army win victories and save countless soldiers' lives. They have ways. Bonnet interrupted Joka. That's the difference between the Saint Etienne machine gun and the Hotchkiss machine gun. Joka's eyes showed confusion, but Charles nodded slightly in agreement. The perceptive Bonnet noticed this and was somewhat surprised. This young man's ability to invent a tank seemed no accident. He appeared quite knowledgeable about military affairs and equipment. Bonnet explained, the Hotchkiss machine gun is excellent, but it's not something bank capitalists own, so they copied it, making only minor modifications to create the Saint Etienne machine gun. Joka finally understood. You mean, they copy tanks, making only simple modifications? Bonnet neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining a smile. A shrewd businessman wouldn't speak too explicitly, lest he offend others, but he clearly acquiesced. Joka stood up angrily. This is shameful theft. They can't do this. We will fight to the end. What can you do to them? Bonnet retorted. Sue them? Go to court? That's their specialty. Joka immediately lost his confidence. Go to court against 200 families? The judges might all be their people. It was better to just give up. He sat down sullenly, considered for a moment, and then asked in a muffled voice, so, what difference would it make if I sold it to you? They can still copy it. Of course there's a difference. Bonnet raised his head, leaned back easily, crossed his legs, and said confidently, I have the little daily news. If they do that, I'll put it in the paper immediately, and the next day all of France will know what they've done. No need for lawyers, the French people can convict them. Then Bonnet lowered his leg, leaned forward a little, and said, so, selling the industrial property rights to me is your best option, Mr. Joka. Chapter 18. I almost fell for it. 100,000 francs. Bonnet, a shrewd businessman, offered an enticing price after breaking down Joka's defenses. Seeing Joka still hesitating, Bonnet added, no one else would offer such a good price, Mr. Joka. Like I said, they can choose to copy. Of course they won't be willing to pay for your intellectual property. Joka turned his gaze to Charles, clearly tempted. In a time when a worker's monthly wage was only 28 francs, 100,000 francs was no small sum, especially with countless unseen hands vying for it. Charles remained silent, mentally reviewing Bonnet's words and summarizing, using the threat of the 200 families to pressure Joka, then enticing him with 100,000 francs, a two-pronged approach of force and temptation. Bonnet knew how to do business. Looking at the two silent men, Bonnet secretly gloated, believing victory was already in his grasp. They had no other choice. However, Bonnet underestimated Charles. He hadn't expected Charles to possess both an inventor's and business acumen. Throughout the negotiations, Bonnet had focused on Djokovic and hadn't been on guard against Charles, perhaps because Charles had sat there harmlessly, appearing as an innocent young boy. Mr. Bonnet, Charles spoke, his tone unhurried yet firm, carrying a youthful naivete. If things were truly as you say, you wouldn't have rushed here at this crucial moment when we're applying for industrial property rights, would you? Bonnet's smile visibly faltered, but years of business experience had honed his composure under pressure. He chuckled lightly. Mr. Charles, this is my style. I demand the same of my subordinates, otherwise, there wouldn't be a little daily news. This made sense. The most important thing in running a newspaper and dominating the market is seizing opportunities promptly. But Charles didn't believe his nonsense. I bet you were prepared. Charles glanced at the lobby outside the VIP room. You paid your staff beforehand to keep an eye out for people applying for tank industry licenses and report to you immediately if anyone does. Bonnet responded with a smile, meaning, that's still my style. Charles made his judgment. If things are really as you say, and no one but you will offer a higher price, then now is not the best time to negotiate, don't you think? Bonnet's smile gradually froze on his face. He hadn't noticed this loophole and didn't know how to close it. At first, Joka didn't understand, but noticing Bonnet's unusual expression, he carefully considered Charles's words and then suddenly realized, that's right, this isn't the best time to buy the property rights, Mr. Bonnet should have let us run into walls everywhere, until the 200 families had crushed us, leaving us battered and bruised, and only then would he make his move. That way, we could have bought the tank industry property rights at the lowest price, and we would have been incredibly grateful. But Mr. Bonnet chose this time, before we'd even left the city hall, to try and buy it for a high price of 100,000 francs. Why is that? Joka became more and more excited, his last sentence carrying a hint of provocation. He was almost certain that Bonnet was in such a hurry because someone else was planning to buy the tank industry property rights, and at a much higher price. Bonnet was speechless. This couldn't be explained away with style, it defied common sense. No businessman would refuse a low price, if he did. There must be a reason, otherwise he would have gone bankrupt long ago. But, Bonnet struggled desperately, the price I offered is reasonable, isn't it? He glanced at the two men with a hint of panic, his gaze as sincere as possible. If you produce tanks yourselves, under their pressure, you might not be able to earn 100,000 francs. Joka didn't know how to refute it. The pressure from the 200 families was an objective fact. They couldn't allow the Bernard family to monopolize tank production. This was an undeniable fact. Therefore, the price of 100,000 francs was indeed reasonable. But Charles ruthlessly exposed Bonnet's lie. No, Mr. Bonnet, you seem to have forgotten the Paris Convention. Bonnet looked at Charles incredulously, then calmly hummed in agreement. Oh, yes. I seem to have forgotten it. Well then, if you're not satisfied with this price, we can talk again. Joka instantly understood the reasoning. The Paris Convention, officially the Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property, was a treaty concluded in Paris in 1883 by Britain, France, Russia, and other countries to protect the international rights of inventors. Before the Paris Convention, protecting industrial property rights between nations was difficult, even giving rise to a group of professional copycats. They constantly monitored other countries' intellectual property registrations, and as soon as a new registration was published, they would immediately copy it and register it in their own country first. By the time the real inventors wanted to register in that country, they found themselves already copycats. The Paris Convention stipulated that all invention applications from contracting states could be considered to have been filed on the date of the first application in their own country, thus preventing inventions from being preemptively registered in other countries. In other words, Charles's tank industrial property rights could also be registered in countries such as Britain, Russia, and the United States. These countries also needed tanks, and Britain and Russia were currently at war and were allies, outside the sphere of influence of the 200 families. Therefore, the value of the tank industrial property rights was far more than 100,000 francs. Joka, seemingly unable to tolerate Bonnet's attitude any longer, pulled Charles to his feet and said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Bonnet, but this isn't a decision we can make. We need to consult my father. As you know, the Bernard family is always ruled by him. Joka remained quite restrained. He didn't want to offend Bonnet. After all, he was the owner of the little daily news, and the media he controlled held considerable sway. Of course, Bonnet nodded helplessly, standing up to hand Joka and Charles their business cards. If you gentlemen change your minds, please feel free to contact me. And the price is negotiable. Bonnet emphasized the last sentence, the implication being that he could offer a higher price than anyone else. Finally, he didn't forget to praise Charles. That was a great invention, Mr. Charles. It saved France. Respect to you. Joka led Charles out of the city hall, glancing back with lingering fear, and exclaimed, I almost fell for that guy's trick. Thank goodness for you, Charles. You defeated that arrogant fellow. Joka looked at Charles, his eyes filled with pride. Teenagers changed so quickly, it was hard to believe he was still a minor. Chapter 19 Taxi Transporting Troops. Joka planned to take a taxi back to town. The journey of over 10 kilometers would cost 8 sous, which he thought was worthwhile, since he could foresee not having to worry about such a sum of money in the near future. However, after waiting for a long time on the street, he couldn't find an empty taxi. Occasionally, one or two taxis would pass by, but they were all full of fully armed French soldiers. Something's not right, Djoka frowned, watching the direction the taxis had gone. It seems they're using taxis to transport soldiers to the front lines. Charles hummed in agreement. The famous incident of taxis transporting troops was later widely publicized by the French as a model of unity between the military and the people in resisting the German invasion. Unexpectedly, right now, at this moment, with Charles and Djoka in Paris, they might have to walk back to town, because there wouldn't be any available transportation, including horse-drawn carriages and ox carts. These primitive means of transport were also used to transport supplies for the army. Just as the two were in a dilemma, a taxi full of French soldiers slowly stopped a short distance ahead. Charles saw Major Brownie among them and yelled at the driver, "Hey, stop. Stop right now." "What's wrong, Major?" the driver asked, turning back to Major Brownie in confusion. "We have to take them." Brownie waved to the two men not far away and shouted, "Hey, Mr. Djoka, Master Charles, but we can't fit any more," the driver protested. "Then get out and swap them with them," Brownie responded rudely. Brownie's actions immediately drew protests from the entire crew. The soldiers and the driver formed a united front. "You can't do this, Major. We're on our way to the battlefield. This is outrageous. Forcing soldiers heading to the front lines off the bus just to carry two capitalists. You don't deserve to be a major, much less a soldier. Your men will be ashamed of you." Djoka and Charles's attire did indeed have a capitalist air about them, fallen capitalists. Major Brownie waited quietly for them to finish speaking, then replied dismissively, "Do you even know who they are?" This only fueled the soldiers' anger. They felt Major Brownie was flaunting the status of these two capitalists and trampling on their dignity. The soldiers' protests immediately turned into growls. "Who cares who they are? Nobody has that right. Will they go to the battlefield for us? If they will, I'll give them my seat. I won't give them any special treatment. You can get out and replace one of them, Major." Two soldiers even exchanged furious glances, seemingly looking for an opportunity to throw the despicable Major out of the car. Major Brownie ignored them and waved to Charles, who had walked to the taxi. "Young Master Charles, are you going back to Darvaz?" "Yes," Charles nodded. Djoka noticed there were no empty seats on the bus and the soldiers all looked furious. He quickly pulled Charles back. "I'm very sorry, gentlemen, we can wait for the next bus. We have time." The driver suddenly realized something and looked at Charles in surprise. "Wait, you're Charles from Darvaz?" Major Brownie smiled faintly and remained silent. He finally understood. "You ungrateful bastards." Sure enough, the soldiers who had been shouting just moments before fell silent. The two men who had been about to fight exchanged bewildered glances. Everyone stared at Charles in disbelief. After a long while, someone asked cautiously in a trembling voice, "Is it that young Master Charles who invented the tank?" Before Charles could answer, Major Brownie laughed triumphantly. "Who else could it be but him? You bastards, he saved France, and you won't let him on the train. I want to know, who is more qualified to sit in this position? Didn't he fight for you? Did you save France like him? Ridiculous. You're actually smug about going to the battlefield, holding your heads high in front of young Master Charles." Major Brownie continued his furious rant, venting his anger as if he wanted to vent all the humiliation he had just suffered on these blind soldiers. No soldier dared to argue, all bowing their heads and listening attentively. Then, amidst the cursing, one soldier jumped out of the car. "I'm so sorry, young Master Charles, please take my seat." No, please take my seat, please take my seat, sir. I can wait for the next car, or walk, it's no big deal." Djoka felt uncomfortable and was about to refuse, but the soldiers dragged him into the car without explanation, as if he had been kidnapped. "It's only right, your role on the battlefield is much greater than ours, your time is more valuable, you might be able to produce a few more tanks. It's honor, sir." Djoka and Charles, unable to refuse, could only accept this reality and sit in the car. As the taxi started moving, the two French soldiers who had given up their seats stood at attention and gave the departing taxi a standard military salute. People walking on the nearby street glanced at this scene, their questioning eyes clearly wondering, who are these two capitalists? How could they get soldiers to give up their seats and salute them? What are you doing in Paris, Major Brownie? Charles asked Major Brownie through the crowded limbs in front of him. I'm here to see General Gallery. Major Brownie, sitting in the passenger seat, turned around and replied, he wants to know about tanks and the detailed combat process. Then he added, everything is as you wish, Master Charles. Only Charles understood that Major Brownie was referring to him taking the blame for training and commanding, without revealing Charles. This surprised the others in the taxi again. The driver, while driving, turned his head slightly and asked Major Brownie beside him, Major, you mean, you're the major who commanded 300 men to defeat several thousand Germans? Major Brownie retorted expressionlessly, what do you think? He was still sulking from the ridicule he had just received. He had never been insulted by soldiers like that before. Another silence fell. The two soldiers crammed into the taxi couldn't get through. Excuse me, Major. You thought I did this to curry favor with the capitalists, is that it? Major Brownie interrupted the soldiers coldly. The soldiers didn't dare answer, which was tantamount to admitting it. Young Master Charles is indeed a capitalist, Major Brownie reprimanded in a superior to subordinate tone, but look closely, they are among the few capitalists willing to give everything for France. They went bankrupt to provide us with food and even invented the tank, which is how we defeated the Germans. He saved many of our lives. Yes, Major, understood, Major, these bastards. Major Brownie tightened his uniform and shrank back into his seat. If you were my men, I would definitely beat you up. Yes, Major. The soldiers dared not say anything more, only frequently casting glances at Charles. The driver suddenly laughed. They'll all envy me. I've carried both the inventor and the commander of the Battle of the Marne. I'm going to have good luck, and he did have good luck. After that, many people came specifically to ride in this taxi, even paying several times the fare. Chapter 20 The Smiling Man. Djoka and Charles alighted in front of Francis's villa. They waved goodbye to Brownie and the others, and the car sped off towards the Marne River with a roar of its engine. The sporadic gunfire and occasional artillery fire could be heard from the front lines. Charles guessed it was 75mm field guns brought in by the French army. Led by a servant, the two entered the villa and vaguely saw Francis and Pierre discussing something with several people in the living room, where red wine seemed to have been laid out. Just as Djoka was about to lead Charles forward to greet them, the butler, Simon, politely stepped in front, saying, Mr. Djoka, Master Charles, the master is discussing business with guests. He instructed that if you arrive, please wait for him in the study, he has something to discuss with you. Djoka grunted in acknowledgement and led Charles upstairs. Charles deliberately slowed his pace as he went upstairs, trying to listen to the conversation in the living room. He couldn't hear clearly due to the distance, but he still heard the word tank, and understood what was going on. Seeing Charles lagging behind, Djoka turned back and asked with a puzzled look, What's wrong, Charles? Are you tired? No, father, it's nothing, Charles replied, quickening his pace to catch up with Djoka. In the antique-style study, the butler thoughtfully served coffee to Djoka and Charles. If you need anything, please let us know. Thank you, Simon. Djoka sat down in a chair and stretched his limbs to his heart's content. The taxi was too cramped, and he felt a sense of oppression. Taking a sip of coffee, Djoka turned his gaze to Charles, who was casually browsing the bookshelf, and asked, Are you sure someone will buy the tank's ownership at a higher price? If not, they would face suppression from 200 established military-industrial enterprises from various families. Djoka wasn't very confident about this. After all, the other party possessed wealth, connections, and power that were completely disproportionate to the Bernard family. Even if they had to confront them, Djoka believed now was not the time. Therefore, selling the ownership to strengthen their own power was probably the best option at present. Confirmed, Charles answered calmly, because they're downstairs. Clang. Djoka was startled, dropping his coffee cup onto the tray, spilling some onto his trousers. You mean? Djoka pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his face as he asked Charles with a hint of disbelief. The people downstairs talking to Francis are here to buy the tank ownership. Charles pulled out a book, Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs, which exposed the decadence, corruption, ugliness, and unscrupulousness of French high society. Charles answered casually as he flipped through the pages, Father, if I'm not mistaken, they should have offered a considerable price. The reason Mr. Francis asked us to leave is because, Charles didn't continue. Djoka was still attached to that family bond, and this might completely sever his hopes. Djoka's face paled, his gaze gradually becoming vacant. He stared at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, struggling to finish Charles's sentence. Is it to steal the profits from us? Charles didn't answer. This was a question his father had to answer for himself. No, impossible. Joka shook his head slightly. He wouldn't do that. You're his grandson, father, Charles interrupted Joka. When Mr. Francis comes up later, he might find an excuse to ask us for the property rights, or an exchange, what he considers an exchange. You should think about how to deal with it. Joka remained silent. He didn't believe Charles was telling the truth, but he also had a strange urge to run away with Charles. Downstairs in the living room, the butler whispered a few words in Francis's ear. Francis nodded slightly, stood up, and bowed slightly. I'm very sorry, gentlemen. I have some matters to attend to. Please excuse me for a moment. You can continue discussing the details. He nodded to Pierre. Pierre understood and immediately took over the conversation, continuing to chat and laugh with the guests. He was very good at this. Francis took a damp towel from the servant, wiped the sweat from his forehead, wiped his hands, and casually tossed it back to the servant. He glanced upstairs before walking up the stairs to his study. As he walked, he thought to himself, I'm sorry, Joka, and Charles too, if Camille hadn't come into the picture, I might have treated you and Pierre's family fairly. However, I've neglected you for almost 20 years. How can I guarantee that everything Charles has done wasn't for revenge? And what about you? Don't you harbor any resentment? Pierre, who was in the living room, glanced at Francis's retreating figure as he went upstairs during a break in their conversation, a meaningful and relieved look flashing in his eyes. Francis hesitated briefly at the study door before pushing it open and immediately offering a smile. Joka, Charles, have you been waiting long? No, father, Joka replied expressionlessly. We just arrived a little while ago. Francis noticed Joka's odd expression and tilted his head, asking, what happened? Oh, no, nothing, Joka said, trying to cover it up. It's just... Camille was frightened by the artillery fire. I was a little worried. Francis laughed. Don't worry about that. We've stabilized the lines. Paris has sent reinforcements, and I heard the 6th Army is assembling and will soon launch a counter-offensive against the Germans. He then turned to Charles, a kind smile on his face. Thanks to our Charles, we're in this situation. It's what I should do, Mr. Francis, Charles replied politely. Francis nodded approvingly, then seemed to remember something. Have you heard? Jarrell is coming back. Jarrell was Pierre's eldest son, Francis's chosen heir, and had been studying in England. Is that so? Joka replied expressionlessly. Yes. Francis sat down in the main seat behind his desk, raising an eyebrow. Bring Camille next time. The Bernard family should take this opportunity to get together. Joka was stunned. His father had never invited Camille before. Did this mean he had already acknowledged her and Charles? Joka suddenly relaxed, excitedly saying, Yes, father. It's an honor. Let bygones be bygones. Francis waved his hand. You've raised my grandson very well, and that's commendable. As he spoke, Francis cast an approving glance at Charles. Joka breathed a sigh of relief, giving Charles a meaningful look, as if to say, You're wrong this time, Charles. Grandpa just wants to acknowledge us. Charles didn't react, pretending not to hear anything and continuing to flip through his book. He knew the important parts were often what followed. Francis changed the subject. But there's a problem, Joka. What? Joka asked. It's like this. Francis's expression turned serious. Gerald has been called back and needs to return. We need to solve this problem. Joka's heart tightened. You mean, Francis continued, I was thinking, could we let Gerald own the tractor factory to produce tanks and machine guns, so he can be exempted from conscription as a special talent? In exchange, I'll hand over the motorcycle factory to Charles. The joy on Joka's face gradually disappeared, replaced by disappointment, anger, and sorrow. Francis seemed to notice Joka's change, and he spread his hands. I know this isn't fair to Charles, but you don't want Gerald to be conscripted either, do you? It was more than just unfair. Charles had tapped into the potential of the tractors, and they were about to become a huge success, and Francis was taking it away from Charles. They even legitimately stole the tank invented by Charles. Even the machine gun factory, acquired at Charles's suggestion, was taken away. All that's left for Charles is a motorcycle factory with no apparent value, and even that's just management. Francis could easily snatch it away from Charles with a single word in the future. He wants to take everything from Charles, and in exchange, He only verbally acknowledges Charles and Camille's identities. Is this just unfair? Djoko slowly rose, his tone surprisingly calm. I'm sorry, father, unfortunately, we just returned from Paris. This morning we registered the industrial rights for the tank and even negotiated a buyer, so, if Jor-El wants the tank production rights, I think there might be some problems. Francis was shocked. You registered the rights? And negotiated a buyer? Charles was stunned. He knew that wasn't the case. The tank rights hadn't been negotiated with a buyer. His father seemed to have become a different person. Chapter 21 Left Wing Right Wing. Greevy had never been so excited. He felt the world had reopened to him, and in his excitement, he took a carriage that very night to Armand's estate. What happened, Greevy? Armand emerged in his pajamas, the sounds of several women's unrestrained laughter echoing from the bedroom behind him. Greevy was unfazed. He was long accustomed to Armand's peculiar habit. Our army defeated the Germans at Darvaz. Armand, Greevy exclaimed excitedly. Oh, Armand walked to the wine cabinet, expertly poured 2 glasses of red wine, took a sip from one, and handed the other to Greevy, replying coldly, so what? They defeated thousands of Germans with just over 300 men. Greevy waved his hand excitedly, like a commander on the battlefield. Armand leaned back lazily on the sofa, replying, you came so late just to tell me the story of 300 Spartans defeating a Persian army. 300 Germans defeating thousands of French soldiers was possible, but 300 French soldiers defeating thousands of Germans, that only happened in fairy tales. It's true. Greevy grabbed Armand's shoulders and shook him. Wake up, Armand. You have no idea what's going on outside. It's all over France. A young man named Charles invented something called a tank. Armand said paused for a moment seemingly believing him, then asked, what does this have to do with us? Are you here to tell me the left's advantage has increased? The vast majority of the left-wing parties were composed of emerging capitalists who controlled banks, factories, and machinery. The right-wing parties were composed of old capitalists, mostly former nobles or landowners. Although wealthy, they had almost no control over society and were always at a disadvantage in the Chamber of Deputies. Clearly, this thing called a tank belonged to the emerging capitalists. Greevy sighed, looking at Armand with a helpless expression. Think about it, Armand. We've always lost to the left. Why is that? Armand was the leader of the Royalist Party, and Greevy was the leader of the Bonapartist Party. Both belonged to the right wing, which hoped to restore the monarchy. Strictly speaking, they were enemies due to different political views, as they supported different emperors ruling France. However, because of the powerful enemy of the left wing, they were oppressed for a long time and eventually became friends. Perhaps exhausted, Armand lay down lightly on the sofa, slightly raising his glass as he replied, what can we do? Their machines can produce massive quantities of rifles and artillery, thus controlling the army and wielding real power, while we only have farmers and hoes. But what if we had tanks? Greevy reminded him, if we possessed that kind of equipment that could defeat thousands of elite German soldiers with just over 300 men. Armand paused, then sat up as if electrocuted, placing his glass on the table. After a moment's thought, he nodded, saying, you're right, Greevy. This is our chance to regain the upper hand. We might have the strength to rival the left wing with a small force and limited rifles. That's exactly what I was saying. Greevy snapped his fingers. Our chance to turn things around has arrived, Armand, and it might be our only chance. But, Armand then worried, the left wing, they know the importance of this equipment, don't they? That's why I came to you, Greevy said. We should unite and use all our resources to secure the industrial rights to tanks. The army needs tanks, and this will increase our influence over the military. Armand's eyes grew brighter, like a long-extinguished flame reignited. No one could understand the desolation of being marginalized and waiting to be eliminated in the arena of power. This wasn't something money could measure, it was despair, powerlessness, and utter humiliation, being slaughtered at will. Now, however, a turning point had appeared. It was up to them to seize this opportunity. 500,000 francs, this was Greevy and Armand's initial offer to Francis. Francis was taken aback. This was already 1/10 of the tractor factory's value, and it was just the initial offer. Tanks were worth that much? Francis felt a pang of envy. He had spent his entire life running the tractor factory to achieve his current success, while Charles had simply pieced together a few steel plates, like a child building blocks, easily completing 1/10 of his achievement. However, the cunning Francis didn't show it. He feigned reluctance and said, "Gentlemen, this equipment can win the war and lead France to victory. Leaving aside everything else, we spent 5 billion francs on reparations alone in the Franco-German War, and that was over 40 years ago. Today, tanks can help France win the war, bringing dignity and glory beyond reparations, along with countless assets about to be plundered, and the lives of countless French soldiers and civilians. All of this, only worth 500,000 francs. Francis calmly poured wine into the two guests' glasses and added slowly and politely, "I think Krasova might also be interested in this." Krasova was the leader of the left-wing radical party. Francis knew how to provoke these two right-wing nobles. Sure enough, Grevy and Armand exchanged a glance, their faces revealing undisguised worry. 600,000 francs, no more, Grevy said. Francis scoffed inwardly. More, possibly 800,000 francs, that lucky little fellow. Of course, Francis wouldn't just stand by and watch such a large sum fall into Charles's pocket. What excuse could he use? Just then, the butler Simon whispered something in Francis's ear. Francis stood up. "I'm very sorry, gentlemen. I have some matters to attend to. Please excuse me for a moment. You can continue discussing the details with Pierre, of course." Grevy and Armand rose gracefully, secretly relieved. Pierre was much easier to deal with than Francis. However, to Grevy and Armand's surprise, Francis soon brought two people before him, his face ashen, a middle-aged man and a young boy, their worn and ill-fitting clothes giving them a somewhat shabby appearance. "Gentlemen," Francis said with a helpless expression, "let me introduce you. This is Djoka and his son, Charles." "Charles?" Grevy jumped up excitedly. "The boy who invented the tank?" "Yes," Francis nodded. "The tank industry rights are in their hands. Once the tank industry rights were successfully registered, it would be impossible to do business without Charles and his guardian, Djoka." Djoka secretly rejoiced. Luckily, Charles had the foresight to register the rights in time. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 22 990,000 francs. Francis had initially intended to remain silent, knowing he would gain nothing if the property remained in Charles's possession and he sold it. However, Charles added, "Although we've reached an agreement with a buyer, we haven't signed a contract. If Mr. Francis can sell it at a higher price, we are willing to offer a commission of 1/10 of the sale price." Francis was stunned. At the current price, 1/10 meant 60,000 francs. No one would refuse such a fortune. Djoka stared at Charles in shock. He had said a buyer has been agreed upon to avoid further conflict with his father and escape as quickly as possible, while Charles had proactively discussed commission with Francis. However, after calming down, Djoka realized Charles was right. Business shouldn't be mixed with personal feelings, and his father disapproved of him precisely because he acted too emotionally. Charles had his own plans. He needed to sell the tank's intellectual property rights as soon as possible. After all, the invention was essentially just adding a few steel plates to a tractor. It wouldn't be difficult for French military enterprises to copy it or circumvent the intellectual property rights. He, along with his family, didn't have the strength to protect their intellectual property rights, and in the long run, it would likely become worthless. Tank intellectual property rights only had meaning in the hands of those capable of protecting their own interests. Francis couldn't refuse the commission, and despite his reluctance, he brought Djoka and Charles to Grevy and Armand. Grevy politely rose and shook hands with Djoka and Charles, paying his respects to Charles. "I've heard so much about you, Mr. Charles. A perfect invention. No one would have imagined that a tractor could play such an amazing role on the battlefield." Armand, legs crossed, leaned back on the sofa without moving. He glanced at Djoka and Charles, his brow furrowing slightly, seemingly with some disdain. Charles was unimpressed. He'd heard that traditional nobles disdained being on equal footing with the lowly commoners, and now it seemed at least some nobles truly held this view. That man named Grevy was likely just putting on a show, actually sharing Armand's sentiments. "You have competitors, gentlemen," Francis said. "I just heard that this morning we registered the property in Paris, and before we even left, someone made an offer." Francis naturally put himself in the buyer's shoes, using "we" in his wording. Perhaps to make the news seem more credible, Francis added, "Bonnet, the owner of the little daily." "Oh, Grevy was somewhat shocked. Do you know how much he offered? Francis turned his gaze to Joka. Before Joka could speak, Charles quietly replied, he offered 500,000 francs. Joka looked at Charles in surprise. Charles's innocent expression made Joka doubt himself. Did Bonnet say 500,000? Why do I remember it being 100,000? Did I remember wrong? Armand chuckled, sitting up straight with a smug look. This means we won, gentlemen. We bid 600,000. He had just suspected that Francis, that old fox, was colluding with his son and grandson to inflate the price, but now he realized he was overthinking it. However, Charles added, domestic ownership only. What do you mean? Armand asked, puzzled. The Paris Convention, Armand, Grevy explained, they can also apply for ownership in other countries. Armand paused, spreading his hands, and asked, so, what was the final offer? Charles looked blankly at Francis. Mr. Francis, how is foreign ownership calculated? Francis grunted and became excited. 500,000 as a minimum, plus at least $1 million more. Wouldn't that increase his commission by tens of thousands? I'm not sure either, gentlemen, Francis said. Can we calculate it as 300,000 for Britain? No, Mr. Francis, Grevy protested. Britain has no need to produce tanks. Their army is fighting in France, and they are using French tanks. Francis pressed his advantage. Then you mean we can calculate it as 300,000 for Russia, which has a need for tanks? Grevy immediately realized he had fallen into Francis's trap. This would bring the total to 800,000 francs. The negotiations then reached a fever pitch. Russia might not even use tanks. They have far more soldiers than we do. No one wants large numbers of soldiers dying on the battlefield. Tanks can win battles and significantly reduce casualties. Besides, even if Britain doesn't have a domestic demand for tanks, they certainly don't want to fall behind in military equipment, so the intellectual property rights aren't worthless. But why should we buy foreign intellectual property rights? It has nothing to do with us. You can choose not to buy them, but that means the foreign intellectual property rights still belong to us. That means we can register a British company to produce tanks in France. Do you still think that has nothing to do with you? Negotiation was something Francis excelled at. Joka and Charles simply withdrew from the war, each taking a small plate and choosing their favorite food from the self-service counter on one side of the living room. Joka chose a beef pizza, and Charles picked out a cream cake. It was already past lunchtime, and the two had been busy all this time without having eaten lunch, and were quite hungry. Joka, munching on his pizza, watched with amusement as the nobles argued in the reception area. He leaned closer to Charles and whispered, "You lied, Charles." Charles nodded. "You lied too, father." Joka laughed and praised, "Well done. Look at them." After rounds of haggling, the tank rights were finally settled for 1.1 million francs, but Francis attached a condition, a cooperative production agreement with the Francis tractor factory. This was clearly a case of using public office for private gain, sacrificing Charles's interests to secure the cooperative production rights. Grevy and Armand did not object. They lacked a factory and desperately needed a mature, readily available tractor factory to produce tanks. The Francis tractor factory was not only the largest and most advanced tractor factory in France, but more importantly, it was the manufacturer that invented the tank and helped the military win the Battle of Darvas. Obviously, tank production by Francis tractor was more acceptable to the military. Therefore, both parties quickly reached an agreement and granted the tractor factory the cooperative production rights. Joka still couldn't believe it was real. 1.1 million francs, minus Francis's commission, leaving 990,000 francs, 990,000 francs earned in just a few days, without any risk. The issues of imitation and suppression by established military industries were things that Grevy, Armand, and Francis needed to face and worry about. Chapter 23 I want to buy all his properties. They signed the contract and wrote the checks. Charles stared at the numbers on the checks and asked timidly, "Mr. Francis, is this enough to buy your tractor factory?" Francis chuckled, "No, Charles. You'll need at least 10 checks like this." Francis was exaggerating. Actually, only 5 would be enough, though this was partly due to trade secrets. After a pause, Francis added, "The motorcycle factory only costs 600,000 francs. You can buy it without a problem." Charles said, "Oh," his face showing obvious disappointment. Grevy and Armand looked puzzled. They didn't understand what was going on with this family, discussing the sale of family assets. However, it wasn't their business. And besides, it was someone else's family affair, so they didn't ask further. On the way home, Joka noticed Charles looking rather downcast and went to comfort him. I know the tractor factory is important to you, Charles, but we can take it slow. After all, we've already made a lot of money, and one day we'll have enough to buy the tractor factory, won't you? 990,000 francs, you should be happy. Charles continued to lower his head, but his tone showed no sign of dejection. Can you still see the villa? What? Joka was taken aback, then realized Charles's demeanor was feigned. But, why? He looked back and replied, almost, only a small part is visible. Charles, who had just looked like a wilted cabbage, instantly regained his composure. He breathed a sigh of relief. Acting was quite tiring. After all, he wasn't a professional. I didn't actually plan to buy the tractor factory, father, Charles said. Didn't plan to buy it? Joka was puzzled. Then why? Before he could finish, Joka understood. What you really want to buy is the motorcycle factory, isn't it? Charles nodded. That's how business works. The more you want something, the more you should act like you don't want it. The less you want something, the more interested you should act like you're interested. Finally, you buy it under duress, out of necessity, having no other choice, or having no other option, thus getting the lowest possible price. Joka chuckled self-deprecatingly. You fooled me, Charles. I can't guarantee I can fool Francis, Charles said worriedly. He's not someone you can easily fool. Joka agreed, then steered the conversation back to the main point. But why is that? I mean, tractors can be converted into tanks, and you invented tanks, yet you don't want them. Motorcycle sales are declining, yet you want to buy one. Motorcycles face similar problems to tractors. Their customer base is mainly lower middle class people. Wealthy people prefer cars. And these lower middle class people are either drafted into the army or unable to afford them due to the poor economic situation, leaving them unsold. Tractors are outdated, father, Charles replied. I've heard that the British Holt 75 tractor went into mass production last year, and it's faster and has a greater carrying capacity than Francis's Holt 60 tractor. Charles turned to Joka and continued, on the battlefield, soldiers naturally prefer tanks with greater carrying capacity and speed, rather than tractors that crawl like snails carrying thin steel plates. The Holt 60 tractor only has a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour, and that's just its top speed, not much faster than a snail. Joka was utterly shocked. But, you just sold the tank industrial rights. The tank rights were sold. They had nothing to do with tanks anymore, right? Father, Charles replied, I will develop a new type of tank using the Holt 75 tractor chassis. It will be completely different from the previous ones, and there won't be any industrial rights issues. Joka was so shocked he forgot to walk. A new tank, developed just like that? And completely without any intellectual property conflicts with the old model? My son is an inventor? After a moment, he reacted and quickly caught up, asking with some skepticism, you mean to sell the tank rights first, then develop another new tank to defeat your own? Charles replied expressionlessly, more or less, but, Joka's eyes widened, this might bankrupt Francis. They'll only be able to sell a few of the tanks they've painstakingly produced, and his tractors will suffer severe sales stagnation due to the emergence of the Holt 75. What's wrong with that? Charles countered. Joka fell silent. In business, there's no father-son relationship, especially since Francis had once tried to completely destroy Charles and take everything away. Since Francis didn't care about family ties, why should Charles? If things continued this way, everything Charles did would belong to the Bernard family and to Francis, not himself. So, there's nothing wrong with that. Joka gritted his teeth. Do it this way, I'm on your side. He had already given up on the family when he learned that Francis wanted to take everything from Charles. After a moment of silence, Joka asked again, why do we want to buy the motorcycle factory? Not just a motorcycle factory, Charles replied. I want to buy all of the Bernard family's businesses. His tone was casual, as if he'd mentioned it offhand. But this casualness only amplified the shock in Joka's heart. Buying all of the Bernard family's businesses is no easy feat. He might not even be willing to sell the motorcycle factory right now. He will sell, Charles analyzed. Right now is when he's most short of funds. His working capital has been almost entirely depleted in previous operations. Joka recalled how Francis had spent all his savings on food before the Battle of Darvez. Besides, Charles continued, cooperative tank production requires startup capital. The commission he earns from us might only be enough for a few days of production. Joka nodded. The tractor factory was a large facility with over 2,000 workers. Just paying their wages alone cost 60 to 70,000 francs a month, not to mention electricity, rent, loan interest, and so on. More importantly, Charles said, he bought the motorcycle factory for the machine gun factory. He didn't see the value in motorcycles. From the beginning, he planned to cash out, and we just happened to have the funds. The value of motorcycles? Deoka asked, puzzled. What was their value? Weren't they destined to be replaced by cars? You'll know later, father, Charles said. Their usefulness won't be much less than that of a tractor. Deoka hummed in agreement. He felt that Charles couldn't be described as precocious anymore, nor could he be described as shrewd as Francis, because he was even shrewder than Francis. He seemed to be able to make Francis look like a monkey. It was unbelievable. Francis was hailed as a business genius in the Bernard family, and his achievements were obvious to all. But in front of Charles, he seemed to be nothing. Unconsciously, he arrived home and saw Camille sitting at the door knitting a sweater in the distance. The faint sunset shone on her, outlining her soft silhouette, like a gentle, colorful cloud. Upon seeing the two figures, Camille quickly put down her sweater, stood up, and waved to them. How did it go? Camille greeted them, a hint of expectation in her eyes. Was everything all right? What Camille wanted to know most was whether Charles's identity had been acknowledged. Everything went well, Djokovic nodded, replying, we don't need anyone's approval. We are who we are? Camille seemed to understand. She nodded silently, turned to give Charles a smile, patted his head, and gave him a hug. Wearing a mask and dealing with others outside must have been very difficult, she thought. Chapter 24. Who'd like to buy a motorcycle factory? The next day, Joka went to Paris again. He cashed the checks and deposited the money into his own account, since Charles was a minor and couldn't open an account. Afterwards, Joka also picked up his checkbook. This was for future business considerations. He still needed to pay Francis a commission of 110,000 francs, and paying by check would be much more convenient. On his return, Joka drove a Ford Model T, its black paint gleaming, its leather seats smooth and soft, its grille gleaming. As he pulled up in front of his house, Joka deliberately honked the horn a few times. He hadn't told Camille beforehand, he wanted to surprise her. Camille, who was preparing lunch inside, didn't realize what was happening. She muttered a complaint about the impolite man, parking his car in front of someone's house and honking the horn repeatedly. Peeking out, Camille saw Joka sitting in his car, smiling and waving at her. Hey, beautiful, wanna go for a drive? Camille gasped, covering her mouth in surprise, then exclaimed excitedly. She rushed to the door, then turned back, shouting to Charles, who was reading in the room, Charles, it's your father. Look what he drove back in. Charles smiled, closed his book, and came out. He had known Joka would come back in a car. To avoid being stranded in Paris like last time, they felt it necessary to buy a sedan. Compared to the 990,000 francs they had just earned, the price of a Ford Model T seemed insignificant. It only cost 1,248 francs, including 3 maintenance services. Note, a Ford Model T sold for $260 at the time, equivalent to 1,248 francs at the exchange rate, and this was the old price. Due to the German advance near Paris causing panic among the people, cars were not selling well, and manufacturers were even worried that keeping these cars in warehouses would make them German spoils of war, hence the significant discounts. As Charles stepped out the door, Joka exclaimed triumphantly, "Can you believe it, Charles? I finally got it for only 910 francs. This was a good deed done by the Germans. It was a quarter cheaper than usual." Camille excitedly looked at it and touched it carefully, as if afraid of scratching off a piece of paint if she touched it too hard. Was this real? She couldn't believe it. It felt like a dream. She thought she would never live such a life, completely unprepared, as if she were being overwhelmed by the sudden happiness. "What are you waiting for?" Joka waved and called to the two of them. "Get in." The car drove smoothly down the street, drawing envious glances from the neighbors on both sides. If someone else were in the car, they might curse, "Damn vampire, flaunting our money in front of us," and spit on the ground. But seeing that it was the Joka family in the car, they waved and greeted them. "What a beautiful car, Mr. Joka, so happy for you. Be careful on the road, Mr. Joka, the road to Terry isn't finished yet." This was what they deserved, the neighbors thought. They were capitalists with a conscience. There weren't many capitalists like them anymore. We needed them. Joka nodded and greeted them the whole way. Camille, sitting in the soft seat, seemed a little reserved. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she waved her thanks cautiously. When the car reached a deserted highway, Camille finally relaxed. She stretched her hand out of the car to feel the breeze, shouting like a little girl, her face beaming with happiness. Suddenly, she turned around, hugged Charles, and kissed him on the forehead. "Thank you, Charles, you're my pride, Mom," Charles protested. Now it was his turn to feel uncomfortable. Joka laughed heartily, his eyes even a little red. Camille said what he wanted to say. He was genuinely grateful to Charles. Joka had always hoped to give Camille and Charles a happy life, but he hadn't achieved it, and it seemed unlikely he would in the future. Charles, however, had made it happen for him. What more could he ask for? This was everything he wanted. Perhaps that's why Francis thought he was pathetic. After lunch, Joka and Charles went to Francis's villa again, this time by car. Francis stood at the study window and looked down, seeing Joka's new car. When Joka brought Charles in, he smiled and said, "Congratulations, Joka, a very nice car." Then he sat down in a chair and added sarcastically, "You have a good son, unlike me." Besides selfishness and cold-heartedness, another unbearable trait of Francis was his sharp tongue and meanness. Joka seemed used to this. He pulled a check from his pocket and placed it in front of Francis. "This is your commission, father." For some reason, Joka found it difficult to say the word father now. Francis took out his gold-chained monocle from the drawer, put it on, unfolded the check, looked at the amount, grunted, glanced at Joka and Charles, and asked, "Aren't you going to consider it?" "Consider what?" Joka feigned confusion. Charles had already told him that if Francis fell for it, he would use this opportunity to promote his motorcycle factory. Francis said, "The motorcycle factory, at the price we agreed on before." Joka looked at Charles. This gesture earned him a contemptuous snort from Francis. What a spineless fellow, letting his own child make the decision. Charles was indeed excellent, but unfortunately, Mr. Francis, Charles gestured towards the window. "I believe you've already seen it. We bought Ford. We don't need motorcycles, but you can produce motorcycles and sell them to others," Francis said. "I originally intended to hand over the motorcycle factory to you to manage." Joka felt a pang of irony. "If that was the case, you shouldn't have sold it, but rather handed it over to us." "I'm sorry," Charles shook his head. "We're unfamiliar with the motorcycle market, and we don't plan to invest until we're familiar with it." "That's dangerous," he was referring to himself, but actually speaking to Francis. Francis wholeheartedly agreed. Charles's words even struck a nerve. He had been in business his whole life but had only ever dealt with two industries, textiles and tractors. Motorcycles were unfamiliar territory for him. Keeping them would only continue to drain his funds. Joka raised an eyebrow and said, "Perhaps I can ask around to see if anyone is willing to buy, father." With that, he took Charles and prepared to leave. Of course, this was all an act. Everything he said was pre-planned. Francis's first reaction upon hearing this was, who would want to buy a motorcycle factory? At this time, offering 600,000 francs? That's insane. Wait, Francis interrupted Joka, "let's talk some more." Chapter 25, I Got a Bargain. Ultimately, the motorcycle factory was sold for 350,000 francs. During the transaction, Charles repeatedly and earnestly tried to persuade Joka, "Father, the war is still raging and the outcome is uncertain. Don't you want to reconsider? We might not even be able to find enough workers. Most of them have already fled. Cars are already selling for 910 francs. How can we expect to get a good price for motorcycles?" Charles was telling the truth, but Joka was known for his soft heart. He reluctantly replied, "Charles, we should have our own factory. Besides, Mr. Francis urgently needs funds. Let's buy it." Francis outwardly agreed, but inwardly he was mocking Joka. "Do you know why I put you aside? Doing business with this attitude will only hand everything over to the other party, you fool." Francis was completely unaware that this was all an act for him. Charles had precisely exploited his belief that Joka would act emotionally to pressure him into a lower price. Joka was no longer the same Joka. At this moment, Joka seemed to have become the person Francis had hoped for, harboring hatred and seeking revenge against the Bernard family, especially Francis. The reason for saying seemed is that Joka's motivation was to protect Charles. He didn't want Charles to repeat his life, or worse. After signing the contract and writing the check, Charles was still fuming and full of resentment. Francis, however, raised an eyebrow at Charles triumphantly, as if to say, "You're absolutely right, Charles. I completely agree with your point of view. The problem is you're a minor, there are some things you can't decide." The two went downstairs in silence. Joka took the crank and started the car, while Charles got in without saying a word. At this time, Ford cars required manual starting. Electric start cars wouldn't be invented for another 5 years. After the car had driven a distance, Joka and Charles smiled at each other. "Good coordination," Joka said. "You're a natural performer." "You're not bad either," Charles retorted. Francis had gotten a bargain this time. The motorcycle factory originally cost about 1 million francs, but he bought it for 500,000 francs. He wanted to sell it for 600,000, but the price was haggled down to 350,000. From Francis's perspective, he wasn't losing money, he was cutting his losses. What he really needed was the machine gun factory, which was continuously supplying the military with machine guns and ammunition. Losing 150,000 francs on the motorcycle factory seemed reasonable. What Francis hadn't expected was that the motorcycle factory would also shine brightly. "Now it's up to you," Joka said, turning to Charles while steering the wheel. "Do you have a plan?" "I mean, the motorcycle factory." "No plan needed," Charles replied. "We just need to produce and then wait." Joka was bewildered. It was that simple? It was that simple. During World War I, the Army's communication equipment was extremely backward. Although there were telephones, they were expensive and only wealthy families could afford them. The special nature of military operations meant that they couldn't be used in large quantities. This meant that inter-unit communication relied on people and vehicles, making the agile and fast motorcycle the preferred mode of transport for signal corps. During World War I, the British Army alone equipped itself with 20,000 motorcycles. The French Army, however, had no upper limit. Although they only equipped themselves with 30,000 motorcycles during the war, this was due to insufficient funds and production capacity, necessitating imports. Otherwise, for an army of 6 to 7 million, 30,000 motorcycles would be far from sufficient. With such a large market before them, and Charles already holding a motorcycle factory, did he still need a plan? Joka suddenly thought of something and asked Charles, "Aren't you worried that Francis is also preparing for the Holt 75 tractor we talked about yesterday?" Charles understood Joka's meaning. As the first person to import the Holt tractor into France, Francis should be paying attention to its development. If Francis also knew about the Holt 75 and rushed to buy it, Charles's plan might fall through. Charles calmly replied, "He knows, but he won't import it." Joka made a hum sound, the car swaying slightly from the distraction. "Watch your car, father," Charles reminded him, then explained, "It's easy to understand. All of Francis's equipment and skilled workers are used to produce the Holt 60. If they were to replace all the equipment and workers with those for producing the Holt 75, it's not something Francis can afford, at least not right now." Djokovic suddenly understood. The key point was that Francis's tractor factory held a monopoly in France. The Holt 60 held 70% of the French market share, and no other domestic tractor factory could compete. As long as Francis continued on this path, it could maintain its leading advantage, so there was no need to upgrade the Holt 60 to the Holt 75, especially now, during wartime. With tractor sales sluggish, there was neither the funds nor the motivation to upgrade. No one was buying tractors not because they weren't advanced enough, but because there was no demand under the threat of war. Upgrading tractors would be an unnecessary and foolish endeavor. So, even though Francis knew the Holt 75 was already popular in Britain, he wouldn't pay the price to import it. He would even suppress the news, letting French farmers believe the Holt 60 was still the best tractor in the world. "You seem to have considered everything," Joka chuckled. "I really don't know what's in your little head. Why don't I see how smart you are when it comes to studying?" "Because studying isn't doing business," Charles replied. "That's torture for me." Joka's expression was somewhat helpless. "Whatever, the purpose of studying is to make money." Before he finished speaking, a fierce barrage of artillery fire suddenly came from the direction of the Marne River, like thunder, one after another. Several stray shells whistled as they hit the south bank, exploding in fields not far from the town, scaring the townspeople into screaming and fleeing in all directions. Joka tensed up too. He stepped on the gas, accelerating while cursing, "Damn it, our army has launched an attack on the Germans." At this time, the car stopped in front of his house, and Camille awkwardly rushed to greet him. Joka practically dragged Charles out of the car, shouting to Camille as they ran back to the basement. To the basement, the three hurried back inside, opened the basement door, and crawled in. Joka gasped for breath as he closed the door, but he was finally somewhat relieved. The artillery fire continued outside, along with the faint sounds of shouts and gunfire. Camille trembled with fear, but mustered his courage and whispered reassurance to Charles, "It's all right, everything will be all right." Joka turned on the light, its flickering beam illuminating the messy basement, the air thick with the smell of mildew and dust. "Don't worry," Joka comforted him, "it's safe here." He added a moment later, "We must have faith in the army, they will soon defeat the Germans and drive them out." Many thought so. General Gerlini had brought in the 6th Army from Paris, and together with the 5th Army, they were to attack a German army group from both sides. 2 armies against 1 German army. Wasn't victory a foregone conclusion? However, war is not as simple as they thought, nor is it a numbers game or a matter of troop strength. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.